You are standing on the deck of an 18th-century British naval ship. The sails creak in the wind above, the rigging sways slightly, and the faint scent of salted pork and tar lingers in the air. It is morning inspection, and one of the most serious infractions a sailor can commit, beyond drunkenness or sloppiness in knot tying, is improper folding of issued clothing. To modern ears, this might seem like an afterthought. But to the naval bureaucracy of the 1700s, the way a sailor stored and maintained his personal kit was a window into his discipline, morale, and, by a strange bureaucratic logic, his seaworthiness. Shirts were not merely shirts. They were a symbol of a ship's order. A British Royal Navy sailor was entitled to remarkably few personal items. A regulation slop chest kit issued to a man-o'-war crewman typically included 2 shirts, linen, often coarse, 1 or 2 pairs of breeches, 1 waistcoat, a jacket, stockings, a pair of shoes, and perhaps a spare neckcloth. This meager allowance had to be maintained with almost ritualistic attention. Each item had its prescribed folding method. Not out of aesthetic preference, but because naval chests, wooden, lockable, and identical, could only store so much. In an era before vacuum-sealed bags and collapsible wardrobes, folding clothes compactly was a skill akin to rigging a sail. You would begin with your shirt. The collar was folded in first, not out, to preserve its shape and resist the fraying that the coarse wooden chests inflicted. The sleeves were crossed precisely at mid-chest, not merely for symmetry, but to ensure that upon unfolding, creases would run vertically down the arms, seen as a subtle marker of personal pride and orderliness. Folding was so integral to ship life that some sailors developed regional or ship-specific techniques. On HMS Centurion, a record notes that shirts were to be folded squarely and set beneath breeches, facing left. Meanwhile, ships under Admiral Rodney's fleet apparently required right-facing placement. Why? No one can say. But much like a modern office's unspoken microwave rules, these customs were not to be questioned. Sailors often shared tips on folding that doubled as maintenance strategies. Folding from the inside prevented exposure to sea salt. Layering linen with canvas jackets minimized mildew buildup. In fact, the Royal Navy unofficially encouraged sailors to wrap their folded items in an additional linen scrap if the ship was sailing through particularly humid waters. But this wasn't just about packing efficiency. Captains' inspections included reviews of the contents of sailors' sea chests. A poorly folded shirt or unbrushed waistcoat could result in lost grog rations or even public reprimand. These inspections were ritualized and occurred after particularly long voyages or before reaching port. The goal: ensure that even after battling storms or navigating foreign harbors, British sailors maintained order, in both appearance and discipline. One particular ship's log from 1771 describes a sailor named Edward Turnley who received 3 lashes not for theft or insubordination, but for hiding spoiled biscuits in the folds of his jacket and staining the fabric. It was seen as a double insult: wastefulness and disrespect of the uniform. In this constrained environment, sailors innovated. They created folding tools, flat boards, or weighted sticks to assist with pressing creases. Some used the heat of the ship's galley stones to soften shirt fibers before folding, laying them momentarily on the cook's counter, though this was not technically allowed. Interestingly, many sailors taught each other regional folding habits. A man from Bristol might show a technique he'd learned from his father's tailoring shop. An Irish recruit might offer a quicker 3-fold method he picked up working dockside laundry before enlistment. These techniques were exchanged, debated, tested. The folding of clothes became not just routine, but social, even oddly competitive. Some crews prided themselves on how crisply they could crease a neckcloth, or how compactly they could stack their breeches and hose. Ship life was otherwise chaotic. Food was unpredictable, punishments were arbitrary, and storms could rip away personal belongings in minutes. Folding clothes properly, carefully, consistently offered a sense of control. It wasn't all discipline and inspections, though. Sometimes, folding was simply a moment of quiet. In the cramped quarters below deck, while hammocks swayed and voices murmured, a sailor might sit cross-legged and slowly, methodically, tend to his tiny wardrobe. The cloth would rustle gently under his fingers. The wood of the sea chest would creak as he placed items inside. It was a meditation of sorts, an act of preserving identity in a world constantly in flux. Some officers even made note of this. A naval surgeon named James Brady observed in 1792 that the man who maintains the neatness of his linen is often the man who escapes scurvy and despair. A romantic overstatement, perhaps, but not without its truth. Still, one might ask, in the midst of navigating rough seas, avoiding cannon fire, and enduring weeks of salted meat, why would the British Royal Navy care so deeply about how a man folded his socks? Perhaps the answer lies in what comes next. How folding clothes became tied to the deeper rituals of naval order, and how even the smallest creases were watched for signs of larger unrest. You are back below deck, the timbers groaning above as waves slap the hull. The lantern light swings softly. Here, among the hammocks and sea chests, lies the true heart of the 18th century ship. Not just cannon and canvas, but the small habits that kept its human cargo functioning. And at the center of those habits, laundry. Not in the sense of washing it, though we will come to that, but in the ritual of handling, storing, and folding it. To a modern mind, folding clothes may seem mundane. But on a wooden warship with no private space, no mirrors, and no predictable routine, how a man kept his personal belongings became an extension of how he held himself together. An unspoken grammar developed. Breeches folded a certain way might signal a sailor was new. Carefully pressed stockings might suggest a man of experience, or a man hoping for a promotion. Folding became part of a sailor's private dignity, especially when nothing else was his. Most naval gear technically belonged to the crown or the ship. The linen shirt on his back, issued. His shoes, on loan. His sea chest, numbered and standard issue. But how he folded and arranged those few items, that was his alone. The Royal Navy, for all its bureaucracy and order, never issued a formal folding guide. It didn't have to. Shipboard culture made expectations clear. On some vessels, young sailors, often aged 12 to 15, serving as powder monkeys or apprentices, were trained by older crewmates in what to fold, when and how. There was a ritualistic quality to this training, a kind of apprenticeship in creases and corners. And yet, despite the lack of manuals, punishments for sloppiness were real. The Articles of War, the legal backbone of Royal Navy conduct, mentioned personal appearance only sparingly, but individual captains had the authority to set shipboard standards. Many extended that authority deep into the realm of dress. On the HMS Sovereign, a ship's log from 1768 details a week-long punishment of extra duties for a sailor who kept his shirt improperly folded in a hammock sling. The crime? A disorderly and slovenly nature, as evidenced by the rumpled linen and a chest in disarray. Harsh by modern standards, but understandable when one realizes that to officers, a disordered sea chest could signal brewing disobedience. There's a quiet kind of genius in how control was enforced through something so small. In a setting where emotions ran high, fights broke out, diseases spread, mutinies simmered, the folding of clothing became a way to channel energy into structure. Captains and lieutenants knew that if they couldn't control the seas, they could at least control shirts. Consider the laundry routine such as it was. Washing was not a daily affair. Could not be. Water was scarce. Soap, when available, was often homemade from animal fat and would ash, harsh and unpleasant. But on calmer days, sailors were sometimes allowed to rinse their linens in seawater. These laundering days were rare, and when they came, they were communal, noisy affairs. Shirts and breeches fluttered from rigging like flags. Sailors scrubbed at planks with stones and brushes. And then came the moment that separated the experienced from the careless. The fold. A damp shirt folded hastily could mildew. A breech left too long in the sun might stiffen beyond wearability. Timing, attention, and airflow all critical. Some sailors became known as folding experts. They found airflow spots in the hold. They created makeshift press boards. They knew which part of the rigging dried best. This attention didn't go unnoticed. Petty officers and midshipmen, ranked between common sailors and lieutenants, often came from middle-class backgrounds with more formal education. Some of them took meticulous notes on crew members' appearance. In letters home, midshipmen occasionally remarked on a man of clean shirt and sharp corners. These phrases weren't just poetic, they were coded evaluations of a man's conduct. What's more, the Navy used folding and dress as part of its public image. When a ship came into port, especially in foreign colonies or near major cities, officers expected sailors to appear in best order. This included white or off-white linen, visibly folded and unwrinkled. If the crew disembarked in wrinkled attire, it could embarrass not just the ship's captain, but the nation it represented. It's hard to overstate how much symbolism folded clothes carried. In a way, the folding was a stand-in for cleanliness. And cleanliness in the 18th century was tied to moral virtue. A tidy man was a disciplined man. A tidy ship was an orderly one. And in the age of empires, order was everything. Below deck, sailors spoke of folding not just in terms of order, but of memory. Some folded their breeches the way their fathers had taught them. 3 folds and a tuck. Some sewed tiny initials into collars to help sort them. Others carried tiny keepsakes, tucked between folds. A lock of hair, a scrap of ribbon, a page torn from a prayer book. Folding became a quiet moment to hold something personal. And then there were the crease superstitions. One widely noted tradition involved folding a shirt inside out before a battle. Some believed it brought luck. Others said it helped with protection from flying splinters. There's no record that it made a difference, but the practice persisted, perhaps because it gave sailors something small to control in the chaos. Even officers were not immune to folding rituals. Though their clothing was of finer quality, silks, embroidered waistcoats, tailored breeches, they too had to fold for storage. Their cabins, though private, were small. Chests were limited. A poorly folded coat could wrinkle permanently in sea air. And a wrinkled coat, like a stained epaulette, could cost an officer his sense of authority. You might wonder, in an age of cannon and conquest, why something as unassuming as a crease would matter so deeply. But the more you understand ship life, the more it makes sense. Folding clothing was not about vanity, it was about structure. In a world where so much could not be controlled, the weather, the orders, the next port, the ritual of folding was a quiet rebellion against disorder. As the years passed, some of these traditions faded. Steam replaced sail. Uniforms grew more standardized. But for a while, on ships with creaking timbers and salt-stiffened shirts, folding clothes was an art of survival, self-respect, and quiet resilience. Yet one mystery remains. Why did certain ships insist on left-facing folds, while others swore by the right? The mystery of left-facing versus right-facing folds might seem trivial. But in the ecosystem of an 18th century ship, where daily life operated like a compact, floating village governed by strict hierarchy and ritual, every detail, no matter how small, could echo broader tensions and traditions. You find yourself once again below deck. The light is dim, filtered through the wooden slats above. A faint pitch smell lingers, mingling with damp linen. A sailor named Isaac, newly pressed into service from Portsmouth, is arguing, quietly but firmly, with an older seaman, Thomas, about how to stow his neckcloth. "You're turning it wrong," Thomas mutters. "It should lie flat, fold side left. That's the way we did it under Admiral Stiddy." Isaac, not yet wise in the way of sea diplomacy, replies, "That's not how they did it on the Vigilant. We faced right. Always." What we're witnessing here is not merely a sartorial debate. It's a conflict of memory, loyalty, and microculture. Each ship functioned as a microstate, with its own codes, superstitions, and mannerisms, shaped as much by the captain's personality as by tradition. These idiosyncrasies weren't published in manuals. They were passed down in murmurs, hand motions, and frowns of disapproval. The direction of a fold, then, became something more than utility. It signaled where you came from, who trained you, and what standard you stood by. In a navy that had begun to institutionalize appearance and behavior, complete with uniform regulations, haircut policies, and punishment schedules, folding became one of the few remaining personal expressions. It was not loud, like tattooing a mermaid on your forearm, but it was persistent, quiet, and subversive in its own way. Uniformity in clothing aboard ships was also a relatively new concept. Before the late 1700s, most sailors provided their own garments. There was no set color, no issued pattern. A ship might resemble a floating bazaar of threadbare stripes, patched canvas, and stained wool. But by the mid-18th century, with the expansion of the Royal Navy and its increasing institutional rigor, uniform slop kits became standard. The Admiralty, ever wary of disorder, even introduced blue coats and white trousers as standard wear by the end of the century. But even with these regulations, variation persisted, especially in how garments were cared for and stored. And folding was at the center of that quiet resistance. A fascinating account survives from the logs of HMS Assiduous, a small sloop of war operating in the Caribbean. In 1784, during a week-long port layover in Kingston, Jamaica, a visiting officer noted that the sailors had organized an unofficial best folded chest contest. The rules were unspoken, but the result was clear. The neatest, best-packed chest received the most nods from mates, the first pick of rations that day, and, according to legend, an extra ration of beer. It was a morale exercise, sure, but it also revealed how deep the ritual of folding had embedded itself in naval life. This wasn't isolated. Across dozens of ships and decades of log entries, we find scattered mentions of neat habit, ordered linen, and remarkable chest. The men who earned such praise weren't just tidy. They were seen as reliable, orderly, perhaps even promotion material. But more than discipline or tidiness, folding offered comfort. Out at sea for months at a time, with no letters, no privacy, and no certainty of return, sailors created little rituals to carve out familiarity. Some folded their clothes while humming the same tune each evening. Others placed their best shirt at the very bottom of the chest, saving it for an imagined future they couldn't describe. One sailor on the Renown confessed to folding his shirt around a small pebble taken from his mother's garden back in Devonshire. No one knew. He folded it tightly, precisely, and silently each week. The act of folding, in this way, became almost devotional. There is another layer to this narrative, one steeped in social class. Officers, with their private quarters and tailors, had the luxury of pressing, steaming, and airing their garments. Sailors did not. Their chests were their closets, footrests, and sometimes their pillows. And in that cramped, communal life, folding was the one form of fashion they had. Their version of tailoring was done by hand on rough planks in the space between mess and watch duty. Some sailors pushed back gently against the standard folds. They developed flourishes, tight triangles in shirt corners, extra wraps in the breeches, even careful tucking of stockings into shoes to create visual balance. These quiet acts of self-styling were rarely commented on directly, but they were noticed. A neat fold could be interpreted as respect for self. An exaggerated one could be seen as vanity or boldness. At times, folding became a political act. During periods of unrest, such as the Spithead and Nowhere mutinies of 1797, some sailors symbolically left their clothes unfolded, refusing to tidy their kits in protest. It was a minor defiance, but deeply unsettling to the officers. The empty creases were like flags, waving silently from open sea chests. It is a peculiar thing to think about, that in the era of tall ships and imperial warfare, sailors protested with shirts left carelessly rumpled, neckcloths draped instead of squared, breeches tossed instead of aligned. A breakdown of folding was a breakdown of trust. Eventually, as the 19th century advanced, naval regulations became stricter. Crews became more professionalized. Uniform standards tightened. Steam replaced sail. Hammocks were strung in regulated rows, sea chests redesigned. And with these changes, the quiet art of personal folding gave way to more uniform storage. Iron presses appeared aboard officer ships. Regulation folding diagrams began to circulate. But the legacy lingered. In naval museums today, carefully preserved sea chests sometimes still show the impressions of tightly packed linen. Fold lines remain, ghost-like, in the weave. In letters sent home by surviving sailors, one reads, "I have folded all my garments now, and should we not see land soon, I suppose they shall remain folded, clean and patient, unlike the sea." And so, the boring act of folding clothes, repetitive, silent, unremarkable, became a language aboard ships. It told of a sailor's origins, loyalties, aspirations. It mapped his mood. It reflected his discipline. It revealed whether he was hopeful, despairing, stubborn, or simply holding on to something solid in a world of motion. We might never solve the mystery of why some ships folded left and others right. Perhaps it doesn't matter. What remains is the quiet truth behind it all. That even on the vast and unpredictable sea, men found comfort in the smallest creases. You step quietly through the archway into a Roman public library, circa 140 CE. The air is heavy with dust, olive oil, and the faint musk of parchment. No voices rise above a whisper. No scroll is unrolled hastily. This is the domain of the librarius, a librarian, but not quite in the modern sense. Here, beneath the frescoed ceilings of an imperial bibliotheca, order is everything, and knowledge lives in the shadows of columns, tucked into wooden cabinets and pigeonhole shelves. The Roman library was not a temple for the masses. It was a carefully curated space for the literate elite, philosophers, senators, poets, and bureaucrats. Most Romans never learned to read. But for the educated few, libraries served as places of study, political networking, and personal identity building. And at the center of this slow-moving world of scrolls and citations stood the librarians. To be a Roman librarian was to live a life of near invisibility. There were no cataloging software systems, no decimal codes, no barcode scanners. Instead, librarians managed enormous collections of scrolls, thousands in some imperial libraries, using a memory-bound system that relied on colored tags, wooden labels, mental associations, and the slow, steady mapping of human intellect. Each scroll was handwritten, often copied by enslaved scribes or educated Greek slaves. These scrolls were made of papyrus or, more rarely, parchment. They were brittle, prone to mold, and sensitive to Rome's fluctuating humidity. Librarians had to keep them rotated, dried, and repaired, sometimes with fish glue or wax. Folding wasn't the issue, rolling was, and poorly rolled scrolls could crack, splinter, or peel into ruin. A careless hand could destroy hours of labor. One of the primary responsibilities of a librarius was inventory control. Scrolls weren't sorted by subject or author as we might expect. Instead, they were grouped by function. Law texts with law, philosophical treatises with philosophy, poetry with poetry. But even these categories were slippery. Was Cicero's De Officiis philosophy or politics? Was Ovid's Metamorphoses poetry or something else entirely? The librarian decided, and woe to the junior assistant who questioned the shelf logic. In larger libraries, such as the Palatine or Ulpian libraries in Rome, scrolls were labeled with small clay or wooden tags, called tituli, hung from their ends with string. These tags bore abbreviated titles and author names, often in Greek. It was the librarian's job to match these tags to the correct scrolls, ensure they were returned to the correct cubby, and occasionally repair or replace them when they cracked or fell off. A misplaced titulus could lead to a scroll being lost for years or forever. Most libraries had two sections, Latin and Greek. The average librarian had to be fluent in both languages. This wasn't for the sake of conversation, it was for accuracy in transcription. Many scrolls were copies of copies, with slight shifts in grammar, spelling, or interpretation. The librarian had to recognize mistranslations, standardize names, and sometimes quietly correct errors made by scribes who copied late into the night by lamplight. The physical space of the library was also under the librarian's domain. He had to keep the floors swept, dust damaged scrolls. Lamps were necessary for reading in the windowless alcoves, but their smoke could stain or even ignite old papyrus. It was common for librarians to extinguish lamps personally after hours. A single stray spark could erase Virgil. Visitors were watched closely. Only a few scrolls could be checked out at a time, and only to recognize scholars or officials. Copies were often made on demand, for a fee. Some librarians employed assistants, sometimes slaves, sometimes freedmen, who would sit quietly with sharp pens and fresh parchment, copying line by line. They did this for hours in silence, with only the occasional pause to stretch stiff fingers or brush away a flake of soot. If the work sounds dull, that's because it was. But dullness was a virtue. A good librarian kept things in their place. A great librarian was invisible. The Roman Empire ran on logistics, grain shipments, tax scrolls, military rosters, trade, inventories, and librarians served a parallel role in the intellectual logistics of the state. Emperors like Augustus and Trajan invested heavily in public libraries, not because they envisioned a literate population, but because control of knowledge was control of narrative. To staff these repositories, they needed men who could manage, organize, and above all, remember. The best librarians were like walking databases. They could recall not only which cubby held Galen's treatise on medicine, but which version of the text it was, who copied it, and what variant phrasing it used in line 43. One famed librarian, Gaius Acelius, was rumored to have memorized the location of every scroll in the Palatine Library. Whether or not that's true, his reputation earned him a villa pension from Hadrian. But librarians were not immune to status games. The higher-ranking ones, those assigned to imperial or senatorial libraries, enjoyed certain perks. Slightly higher pay, nicer tunics, and, in rare cases, access to imperial correspondence archives. Lower-ranking librarians, often former slaves or those of plebeian birth, staffed local libraries, struggling with limited scrolls, poor lighting, and demanding patrons who believed a loud voice was proof of philosophical insight. Despite these challenges, many librarians left behind quiet legacies. Some appended brief marginalia to texts. Checked, restored, c. Flavius, in the consulship of Severus. Others developed shorthand indexing systems now lost to time. Occasionally, a librarian might preserve a dying text by transcribing it anew, noting, "Found in damaged state. Words missing after line 19. These were not grand gestures. No statues were erected in their honor. But the survival of countless ancient works, Seneca, Pliny, Aristotle, Homer, owes itself to the diligence of men hunched at wooden desks, cataloging with oil-stained fingers and quiet eyes. Still, one wonders, did they resent the work? Or did they find peace in its predictability? What passed through the mind of a librarian as he rolled and re-rolled the same scroll, year after year, knowing it might never be read again? Let us return to the quietude of the Roman Bibliotheca. The same librarian you saw in section 1, perhaps named Lucius or Marcus or Apollodorus, now sits at his worn table in the early hours of the afternoon. The light filters in slanted through a high clerestory window. You can hear the scratch of a reed pen on parchment and the occasional distant cough echoing through the columns. It is copying day. Librarians in Imperial Rome didn't just store texts, they preserved and propagated them. Scrolls deteriorated over time, and each new generation of readers required fresh copies. A scroll read too often might fray at the edges or break along creases. A scroll ignored too long might be nibbled by mice or silently mold in its slot. Thus, librarians developed a kind of triage system, which works needed duplication which should be retired, and which, though politically sensitive or philosophically outdated, should quietly disappear. This task often fell to junior assistants known as librarii minores, or to scribes employed by the state. These men, many of them slaves trained in Greek and Latin, were human photocopiers. They copied without commentary. They copied for hours. Errors in their work, skipping a line, misreading a faded character, could go unnoticed for generations. To mitigate this, some libraries employed a read-aloud system. One scribe would read from a master scroll, while several others wrote simultaneously. It was slow and prone to mishearing, especially with Greek loanwords or poetic contractions. But it allowed for faster duplication when demand was high, such as when a popular author like Seneca or Plutarch was in fashion. Demand for copies could spike unpredictably. If a certain senator quoted Epictetus in the Forum, citizens might visit the library in search of his maxims. If a military commander returned with tales of having read Livy in the field, his exploits might boost interest in Roman history. The librarian would then scramble to produce enough scrolls for eager patrons, knowing full well that interest might wane just as quickly, and those copies would gather dust. The logistics were daunting. Each scroll might range from 10 to 30 feet long, written in narrow columns, rolled tightly around wooden rods called umbilici. Ink was made from lampblack or boiled gall, and parchment could crack if handled too roughly. Mistakes had to be scratched out or patched with paste. Rewriting a scroll could take weeks. Librarians also had to decide what not to copy. Censorship in Roman libraries was subtle but ever-present. Texts deemed politically dangerous or morally suspect could be removed or marked for exclusion. In some cases, the librarian would write a polite but damning note, "Text incomplete, damaged in transit." In other cases, entire works would vanish from the shelves, replaced by safer alternatives or abridged versions. An anonymous librarius in Alexandria once noted that a copy of Lucan's Pharsalia had been edited by imperial request. What the edits entailed, we may never know. Political sensitivities aside, librarians also faced the more mundane challenge of scroll misplacement. Without a formal cataloging system, no card files, no call numbers, scrolls could easily vanish into the wrong cubby, especially if a patron returned them carelessly. A misplaced scroll might remain hidden for years, obscured behind an unlabeled text or stacked behind a column's shadow. Some librarians developed memory tricks. One favored technique was color-coding scroll bindings: red for poetry, black for legal texts, blue for medicine. Others memorized scroll positions through verbal mnemonics or even short poems. A particularly diligent librarian might walk the entire library daily, tracing each shelf with his fingertips, whispering titles to himself like a litany. But not every library had the grandeur of the Palatine or Ulpian libraries. Provincial libraries, such as those in Ephesus, Antioch, or even smaller cities like Arles or Leptis Magna, often operated in cramped converted buildings, lacking dedicated staff or climate control. Scrolls were more prone to moisture damage, and rats were a constant threat. One surviving letter from a librarian in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, complains that the scrolls on Gallic customs have been gnawed again. "I suspect the mice are philosophers." He was only half joking. Rodents were one of the most persistent enemies of Roman librarians. Despite these hardships, many librarians persevered in quiet pride. They saw themselves as caretakers of the Republic's mind, even as the empire shifted beneath their feet. The best librarians tracked variations between scroll copies, marked unique phrases, and noted when one philosopher contradicted another. Their notations, often written in the margins, helped preserve a record of intellectual debate that textbooks alone could not capture. Some librarians even gained fame for their discretion. When Emperor Hadrian requested a rare philosophical tract that had been politically suppressed decades earlier, the librarian of the Athenaeum, a young freedman named Helvius Priscus, managed to retrieve a copy from behind a false wall. He presented it without commentary. Hadrian, amused and perhaps impressed, promoted him to curator of the imperial library. Yet, this visibility came with risks. During times of unrest, civil wars, regime changes, or purges, libraries were sometimes raided and librarians questioned. Their knowledge, once a badge of honor, became a liability. Which books had they preserved? Which had they hidden? Who had requested which copies? Still, librarians endured. They wrote letters to each other across the empire, asking for missing texts or sharing marginal corrections. They compared translations, corrected each other's misattributions, and celebrated when lost scrolls resurfaced in coastal trading towns. Imagine, for a moment, one of these men, call him Gaius Rufus, kneeling in a quiet chamber in Carthage. He unrolls a scroll, feels the texture of aged papyrus under his fingertips, and finds, to his astonishment, a treatise thought long lost. A fragment of Sappho's lyric poetry, copied in clumsy but careful script. He stares at it in silence. No fanfare, no reward. He simply makes a note in the margin. New copy discovered, lightly damaged. Transcription to begin tomorrow. What texts were never found again? What masterpieces crumbled in forgotten corners while librarians copied safer, more popular works? It is late evening in the Roman world. The library is quiet again. Lanterns dimmed, scrolls tucked away like sleeping citizens in their homes. Somewhere in the upper floors of the Palatine Library, a librarian carefully extinguishes a lamp. He closes the shutters, checks the leather strap on a scroll's binding, and locks the doors. He doesn't know it, but he is one of the last in a centuries-long line of men whose quiet work preserved the intellectual skeleton of the Roman Empire. In this final chapter of our journey through the dusty lives of Roman librarians, we step back to look at the broader decline, the slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of systems, routines, and knowledge that these men had preserved for generations. You must understand, libraries did not fall in fires and sieges alone. Most were not destroyed in cinematic blazes or razed by barbarian hordes. Instead, they declined by inches. Scrolls weren't copied because a scribe had died. A patron failed to return a borrowed treatise. A librarian retired and was never replaced. A war diverted funds. A roof went unrepaired and rain crept in. Knowledge faded not with a scream, but with a slow, uninterrupted silence. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the Roman world was in flux. Political instability, economic strain, and religious upheaval reshaped public institutions. Libraries, once centers of intellectual display and elite leisure, became less central to civic identity. The rise of Christianity brought new texts, new priorities, and new guardians of learning. Bishops began to oversee scriptoria. Scrolls were replaced with codices, early bound books that were easier to store and faster to copy, but required different systems of organization. Some librarians adapted. They learned the new indexing techniques, shifted from scroll storage to shelving-bound volumes. But others, steeped in older methods, found themselves adrift. Their careful notations and tag systems didn't apply to codices. Their scroll inventories became obsolete. And the scrolls themselves? They decayed. Without active copying and care, even the best-preserved texts became brittle. The knowledge they contained, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, geography, began to vanish. Ironically, many texts that did survive did so because of these librarians' uncredited labor. Their marginalia were copied into Christian monastic texts. Their variant spellings were preserved in glossaries. Their corrections, carefully added in faded ink, allowed future scholars to understand obscure references or make sense of fragmented passages. Even the rhythm of how we now read ancient authors, broken into books, chapters, arguments, owes something to these ancient custodians who first divided long scrolls into sections for easier consultation. Their influence echoes through every classical anthology and every university library catalog. But what of the men themselves? They were rarely remembered. Their names, when they appear at all, do so in margins or brief dedications, copied by Sextus, librarian of the Library of Tiberius, or curated by Antigonus under order of the proconsul. No statues were raised for them. No epic poems sang their praises. Their legacy lies in what they saved, and in what they couldn't. For every scroll that made it into the hands of medieval monks, 100 were likely lost to time. We know of entire libraries, like the one in the Temple of Peace, whose contents are undocumented. What did those walls hold? Legal records? Comedies? Obscure cosmologies? The Roman librarian would have known, and now no one does. And yet, their influence remains in subtler ways. Their love of precision shaped classical Latin style. Their sorting methods influenced medieval scholars. Their emphasis on preserving variant readings laid the groundwork for modern philology. Even the term library, bibliotheca, is their gift. If you listen closely to the silence of an archive, you can almost hear them still, rustling parchment, murmuring author names, checking for cracks in the bindings. In the end, the Roman librarian was not a sage or a priest or a poet. He was a custodian of scrolls, of systems, and of civilization's memory. His world was dusty, repetitive, and often thankless. And yet, in his own quiet way, he shaped what survived of the ancient world. Today, when you open a copy of the Aeneid or Plato's Republic, pause for a moment and imagine the hand that first rolled it back up, carefully tied the string, labeled the tag, and placed it on a shelf in a columned room, trusting that someone someday might need it again. And ask yourself, how many other scrolls were left unlabeled, unread, slowly turning to dust in the silence? It was a foggy morning in London, sometime in the mid-1860s. You are standing in the basement kitchen of a large townhouse in Belgravia. The upper floors are quiet save for the occasional creak of wood or the clink of silver being polished upstairs. But down here, the real machinery of Victorian respectability hums steadily, powered not by steam but by shoulders, elbows, and tea towels. Yes, tea towels. Those unassuming rectangles of linen, always neatly folded, bleached to a near-blinding white, and pressed with quiet reverence by the under-butler or the second scullery maid. In an era of chimney sweeps and cholera, there may be few symbols of quiet domestic order more overlooked or more essential than the Victorian tea towel. Tea towels were not mere cleaning cloths. In many homes, especially among the middle and upper classes, they were a quiet declaration of a household's discipline. Woven from pure linen or sometimes finely spun cotton, tea towels were designed to dry china and glassware, items far too delicate and socially significant to be left to rougher rags. The quality of one's tea towel could be the difference between a well-received afternoon tea and whispered gossip about water spots on the sugar bowl. The average Victorian household, at least one with aspirations, might have anywhere from 6 to several dozen tea towels, each laundered and ironed to standard. In wealthier homes, towels were even embroidered with monograms or household crests, sometimes in red thread, thought to resist frequent boiling better than blue. In working-class homes, towels were reused and patched, but still treated with a form of practical dignity. Enter the domestic staff. For them, tea towels were not simply part of the laundry, they were their own category. Scullery maids, often the youngest and lowest-ranked staff member in the household, were responsible for washing, drying, and folding them. They learned early on to differentiate between good towels for tea services and guests, middling towels for kitchen glassware and everyday dishes, and scrap towels for the grubbiest pots or for polishing boots. Washing them was no small feat in the mid-19th century. There were no electric washers or chemical detergents. A standard laundering session involved soaking the towels overnight in soap flake, infused water, scrubbing them against a washboard the next morning, then boiling them to sterilize and whiten the fibers. In some households, bluing agents, made from indigo, were added to make whites appear crisper. And after washing came drying, not in a machine but outdoors if the weather allowed, or near the basement stove if it didn't. Drying too slowly could lead to mildew. Drying too quickly could cause stiffening. And then came ironing. Victorian irons were cast iron implements heated directly on a stove. They had no dials. Their temperature was gauged by spitting on the surface and observing the sizzle rate. Too cool and the wrinkles stayed. Too hot, and the linen scorched, staining it yellow and making it brittle. Ironing tea towels became a kind of art. They were folded into thirds, then halved again, to create a flat, layered rectangle suitable for stacking. The folds had to align perfectly, creased but not overpressed, or the linen could weaken over time. More than one housekeeper was known to reject a towel for ragged edge alignment or uneven press finish. The placement of folded towels also mattered. In wealthier homes, they were stored in separate drawers or boxes labeled by purpose: drawing room tea, garden service, guest towel, china use only. A misfiled towel could result in quiet reprimand. After all, in Victorian society, propriety extended to every inch of a household. Ironically, the tea towel's importance grew precisely because of its modesty. It wasn't a showpiece like a silver spoon or an embroidered pillow. It lived in the margins, appearing briefly between the china and the hand that served it. And in those brief appearances, it whispered order, cleanliness, and diligence. This whisper carried up the social ladder. A well-kept towel reflected well on the butler. The butler's orderliness reflected well on the housekeeper. And their competence reflected on the mistress of the house. And so, the linen in a drawer on the lowest shelf of the pantry became part of the machinery of Victorian class performance. Even in less affluent homes, tea towels were carefully maintained. A laundress working in Hackney in the 1870s noted in her diary, "The towels I mark in corners, always in red. Ma says it keeps us decent." These were not towels for display, they were tools of self-respect. In the broader domestic economy, tea towels also gained quiet significance. Linen makers often used towel designs to experiment with new weave patterns. Some manufacturers, like the Irish firm Dunn and Company, produced seasonal towel collections, marketing them subtly to household managers through printed catalogs. A pattern of barleycorn weave in 1875 was noted for its rapid drying ability, and households paid extra for it. But perhaps most telling is how the tea towel entered the cultural imagination of the time. Not through writing or painting, but through omission. The towel was always there, always used, always refolded. Yet it rarely made it into novels or letters. It was too ordinary, too embedded in the daily routines of life to be noticed. And yet, its very invisibility was part of its power. The towel didn't need to be named. Its crispness or lack thereof spoke volumes. One might wonder, how many daily dramas unfolded around those towels? How many young scullery maids cried quietly after burning a corner? How many were promoted for mastering the triple-layer fold before their peers? And how many folds, smoothed lovingly with calloused hands, bore witness to unspoken hopes, of rising through the ranks, of catching a kind glance from the undercook, of one day having a home of one's own? The clock in the scullery ticks softly, an oddity, since few kitchens could afford the luxury of timekeeping. But this one does. It marks the hours of quiet toil, of folding and stacking, of matching linen fibers to social standing. The tea towels sit nearby, pressed and poised, waiting for their brief moment in the drawing room. Their whiteness seems to glow faintly in the dim light, testimony to hours of invisible labor. In Victorian Britain, the tea towel was not merely a utilitarian tool. It was a node in a deeply gendered, class-defined, and almost ceremonial order. One could say that it was part of a broader domestic science, the kind taught in manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, which devoted not insignificant space to laundering, folding, and storing linen of various grades. The towel was expected to be white, clean, and folded with grace and proportional accuracy. It was a silent code. Among servants, folding techniques became a source of pride, and occasionally rivalry. A well-folded tea towel, crisp, aligned, gently warm to the touch, could be enough to catch the approving eye of a senior maid or even the housekeeper. Informal lessons were passed along during quieter hours. Fold like this, edge to center, then a book fold over, a senior maid might say. The mistress likes no seams showing when she lifts it from the drawer. Apprenticeship in towel folding was rarely formalized, but it was systematic. A new scullery maid might begin with kitchen rags, then progress to the lesser-used tea towels, then, only after demonstrating care, move on to guest linen. One slip and she could be returned to floor scrubbing for a week. It was said that you could track a servant's rise in status by the towels they were allowed to touch. And towels weren't just folded, they were counted. Inventories of linen were taken monthly, sometimes weekly, especially in larger households. Each towel had a number or stitched initial in one corner. At times, separate towel ledgers were maintained, often locked in the housekeeper's room, recording wear, tear, and retirement. A towel fraying at the hem would be recorded and either mended or demoted to polishing duty. But let's turn from the below-stairs world and step upstairs, into the drawing room. Here, towels made their rare public appearance, folded neatly over the arm of a serving girl, or laid across a small tray bearing the tea set. While never the focus, their presence was coded. A guest might notice a lace-trimmed towel and mentally note the refinement. A host might glance sideways to check if the towel's edge was showing a wrinkle, a signal of a careless staff or a fraying household order. Some ladies of the house involved themselves directly in linen management. They prided themselves on the condition of their tea towels. Embroidery became fashionable, not just initials, but entire floral borders or lace inserts. These were often done by the lady of the house herself as a mark of feminine diligence, or by her daughters who would proudly point out, "That is my daisy corner. Mama had it starched for Mrs. Merriweather's visit." The towels became status objects in subtle ways. Catalogs from high-end linen merchants like J. Polar and Sons or the Belfast Linen Company advertised tea service cloths in sets, with matching patterns and monogramming included. Some households rotated towels seasonally, using floral motifs in spring and more subdued stripes in winter. Despite this aesthetic role, functionality remained paramount. The quality of the weave was everything. Twill, damask, and plain linen each served different roles. Twill was prized for its absorbency and used for heavy teapots and porcelain drying. Damask, with its lustrous patterns, was kept for display trays. Plain linen handled the actual work of drying cups, which had to be spotless and unchipped. A good towel had to strike the right balance between softness and resilience. Too soft and it wouldn't polish. Too coarse and it would scratch. Thus, older towels were often preferred well-washed, broken-in, familiar. Let's not forget how many towels were needed in a day. A single tea event could require as many as 6. One to polish cups before serving, one for spills, one for washing up, one to cover the service tray, one for the sugar bowl to prevent moisture, and one spare just in case. Multiply this by several daily teas, add laundry cycles, and you begin to understand the quiet, linen-heavy rhythm of Victorian domesticity. Folding wasn't the end of the towel's life cycle either. Some were re-ironed before use. Many were lightly spritzed with lavender water or vinegar to maintain freshness and discourage moths. And they were folded not just for storage, but for display. Stacked with the embroidered edge precisely facing forward, folded corners aligned, all hinting at invisible care and invisible people. In charitable institutions and workhouses, towels played a different but equally symbolic role. Towels were used to train young women in domestic industry, a euphemism for servant readiness. Girls who demonstrated talent in folding and care of linen were sometimes offered positions in better homes. Their test? Fold a set of towels identically in under 20 minutes, without fraying the edge or wrinkling the body. A silent audition for a better life. Folding, then, was both skill and signal. It's no wonder that, in some households, the tea towel was the last thing a servant folded before bed. Not because it needed doing, but because it marked the end of the workday. One final towel. One final crease smoothed, fold aligned, and corners checked. A last whisper of order before sleep. What was it like to carry this level of detail in your fingers each day? To iron, fold, and press dozens of rectangles into uniformity, knowing no guest would ever notice, unless something went wrong? What did it mean to fold toward invisibility? It's twilight now. The gaslights are flickering to life along the narrow London streets, casting halos in the mist. Inside a modest terrace house, not one of grandeur, but of comfortable striving, a mother kneels beside the hearth, carefully pressing a linen towel against a warmed brick. She is not a housekeeper or scullery maid. She is a shopkeeper's wife. And yet, she folds the towel with the same practiced care seen in the great townhouses of Mayfair. This is the final, quiet truth of the Victorian tea towel. It became a domestic equalizer. Long after grand parlors gave way to more modest drawing rooms, and well-starched house uniforms gave way to rolled-up sleeves and personal toil, the towel remained. It endured. Its function stayed the same. Absorb, polish, present, and with it, the rituals of folding, laundering, and displaying that lent dignity to even the smallest home. In these working and middle-class homes, towels became personal objects, worn soft with use, patched and stitched, yet still folded neatly in drawers lined with old newspaper. Mothers taught daughters the same folds they learned in service. Some added initials with needle and thread, not to impress guests, but to preserve a sense of order and ownership. Household manuals for the growing middle class in the 1880s and 90s began to include towel management sections. A well-tended linen press is the mark of a civilized household, wrote Florence Hartley in her Lady's Guide to Perfect Housekeeping. The phrase appeared in a dozen editions over 2 decades. And indeed, it was true. A home might be chaotic, children crying, soup boiling over, coal leaving smudges on the wall, but the linen drawer was a bastion of composure. Folded, aligned, and scented with lavender or rose soap, the tea towel became a daily, tactile affirmation of domestic control. Even as societal roles shifted, with the rise of women's education, growing debates about suffrage, and early labor reforms, the towel persisted. Folding it was often one of the few moments in the day that belonged wholly to the woman folding it. No audience, no instruction, just fabric, form, and familiarity. There's something almost meditative about that moment. Warm iron, linen pulled taut, the sigh of fibers creasing to memory. Even now, modern historians looking through estate inventories or household letters note how often towels appear as part of inheritance lists or trousseau logs. They weren't valueless. They were, in many cases, the one textile object that passed unassumingly through generations. One such example is the diary of Clara Rendell, a governess who lived in Oxfordshire in the 1880s. In a battered notebook, she records, "Today I folded the last towel from Mother's chest, stitched anew the hem she patched in 71. Strange to think she touched this same cloth. That tea towel, now housed in a small historical archive, still bears the tiny red initials R in the corner. You can still see the crease marks, faint as fingerprints. In this way, tea towels bore witness to lives. They polished the porcelain of wedding gifts, dried the cups of morning tea, and lay folded in drawers as children grew, moved out and returned. They were touched more than they were seen. By the end of the Victorian era, changes in domestic life, electric irons, centralized laundries, the slow decline of live-in servants, meant that the routines around tea towels began to fade. But the memory of those folds lingered. They were built into hands, into habits, into how one person might show another that they cared, not with words, but with cloth warmed, pressed, and laid just so. It's worth asking, in this final section, why does this all matter? Why do we spend so many words on something so banal as a towel? Because history is not only in revolutions and treaties. It's in the objects that moved silently through daily life, tools of order, dignity, and resilience. The towel was not just about drying teacups. It was about holding on to a sense of control in a world where so much income, illness, class, reputation was unstable. A tea towel, folded just right, said, "This household is in order." It said, "I care." It whispered, "I am capable." And that whisper, echoed across parlors and pantries, grand homes and boarding houses, was part of what built the Victorian world. So the next time you fold a towel, think of the women and girls who did it before you. Quietly, competently, every day, in rooms full of steam and soap, with no expectation of praise. And ask yourself, in a future world of machines and speed, what humble task will be the last to fade? The year is 899 CE. You are in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, walking the cool marble corridors of the great palace of Constantinople. Silk curtains sway in the warm sea breeze, muffling the sound of sandals against tiled floors. Outside, the city bustles with scribes, scholars, merchants, and monks. But inside the palace, specifically, inside the inventory chamber of the Sicelian, the imperial treasury, a quiet drama is unfolding. A spoon is missing. Not a sword, not a jewel, not a chest of gold bezants. A spoon. It is, to be precise, a silver serving spoon from the imperial banquet set, known as the trapezophoric in Argyricon. It is engraved with the Chiro, the monogram of Christ, and bears a faint floral pattern near the handle, standard for late 9th century tableware issued to high ceremonial officials. And now it has vanished. In the context of Byzantine court life, this is no small matter. The Byzantine Empire was an administrative machine of breathtaking complexity. Every item in the emperor's possession, every sandal, every candle, every dining implement, was logged, cross-referenced, and accounted for in triplicate. The empire did not trust to memory. It trusted to parchment and protocol. The spoon was last seen 3 days ago, used during a midday ceremonial luncheon in the triclinos, the domed dining hall reserved for mid-ranking dignitaries. After the meal, it should have been returned, along with 47 other identical pieces, to the silver steward, or Chartularios to Argyrikou. That it wasn't suggests not theft, but disorder, perhaps an error in counting, perhaps a servant distracted, perhaps even a misplacement beneath a napkin. But in Byzantium, disorder was dangerous. The empire, for all its shimmering mosaics and theological treatises, lived in fear of disarray. It saw the slightest breach of protocol as a crack in the divine order. If a spoon could go missing, what else might slip through the cracks? Enter the spoon investigation. The incident is recorded, perhaps embellished, in the margins of a surviving inventory log now housed in the Vatican Library. The entry is terse. 1 silver spoon, assigned to 3rd table, unreturned as of morning reckoning. Investigation begun. You might imagine a frantic search, a banging of cupboards, a shaking of linen. But that's not how Byzantines operated. The response was procedural. The Logothetes II Genikou, head of the fiscal administration, ordered a recount of all imperial tableware. Scribes were summoned. Each spoon was weighed, measured, and matched to prior records. Items were placed on velvet cloths, checked for scratches or irregularities. The staff of the Khoitan imperial bedchamber were interviewed, even though they had nothing to do with silverware. Why? Because protocol demanded it. Every branch of the palace administration had overlapping responsibilities, a Byzantine strategy to discourage conspiracies and catch small mistakes before they ballooned into scandals. The chief eunuch, who managed domestic affairs, made a formal notation in the Des Canonicon, the official household registry. The serving maid responsible for the third table was temporarily reassigned to incense management. The silver steward, fearing reprimand, offered to replace the spoon with one from his own household. But no one accepted. It was not just about the spoon. It was about the idea of the spoon, the system it represented. In Byzantium, spoons weren't merely utensils. They were symbols of order, hierarchy, and theology. Each meal in the palace followed sacred structure. The emperor dined from gold. Patriarchs used silver. Foreign ambassadors received brass or polished tin, depending on their status. And the trays that bore these spoons were equally coded. A spoon out of place meant more than poor logistics. It suggested that the heavenly order mirrored by the empire had suffered a misstep. Spoons were also part of court ceremony. During the Feast of the Dormition, a silver spoon would be used to serve honeyed dates, an act meant to signify the sweetness of the Virgin's rest. During Epiphany, the first spoon dipped into the wine bowl was reserved for the protospatharios, a high-ranking official, who then symbolically passed it to the emperor, who, of course, would not use it, but have it returned, wiped, and archived. And so, a missing spoon threatened more than a kitchen count. It unsettled ritual. Whispers began to circulate in the palace halls. Had a servant stolen it for sale? Had a foreign envoy pocketed it as a souvenir? Had a clumsy scribe knocked it into a brazier and hidden the accident? Or was it merely tucked beneath a linen napkin, misplaced in haste? The eunuchs debated quietly. A special fast was held by the kitchen staff, part penance, part plea for divine intercession. And all the while, the emperor, likely Leo VI, known as the Wise, remained publicly silent on the matter. But palace insiders say he was not pleased. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the palace's cleaning stewards performed a rare linen audit. Tea cloths. Yes, Byzantium had tea-like infusions. Towels and table coverings were shaken out, examined for silver catch, and folded anew. Several spoons from older sets were uncovered during this process. One dated to the reign of Basil I, long thought melted down. But not the missing one. 3 days turned into a week. The incident began to take on an air of legend. Jokes spread among the scribes. What is round, silver, and feared by the entire treasury? But for those involved, it was no laughing matter. Reprimands loomed. Promotion lists stalled. The emperor delayed the next ceremonial banquet, citing inventory irregularities. Some speculated that this was mere symbolism, a gesture of discipline, a way to remind the court that no item, however small, was beneath notice. What was it, then, about this spoon? Was it the item itself or the system it represented? And would the empire find peace again if, by some miracle, it reappeared? It has now been 12 days since the silver spoon vanished from the third table. The weather in Constantinople remains warm, with gulls wheeling above the golden dome of Hagia Sophia. The hippodrome bustles with chatter and chariot wagers. But within the palace walls, the tension has curdled into ritualized unease. You walk through the outer courts of the Bucolian Palace Annex, and hear low murmurs. The spoon, matter, to Zedima II Catalia, has stalled a planned diplomatic banquet with envoys from Trebizond. Not cancelled, merely delayed. But in an empire whose legitimacy flowed from order, that delay sends ripples through every bureaucratic current. Inside the imperial inventory chamber, the anxiety has become procedural. The Logothetes II Oiku, overseer of the imperial household, has ordered a formal inventory reconciliation rite, rarely invoked and reserved for disturbances of sacred symmetry. What this means in practice is a full recitation of the silverware registry aloud, performed by 2 chanting scribes, flanked by junior assistants who physically match and lift each item as it's named. It is slow, reverent, and exhausting. The ritual serves several purposes, as a reaffirmation of administrative control, as a kind of audit, and, somewhat superstitiously, as a means of drawing divine attention to what has gone wrong. In the mystical mindset of Byzantium, even household disorder might hint at heavenly displeasure. Thus, the rite becomes penitential. The steward of silverware, now pale and visibly sleep-deprived, submits daily written affirmations of his own accounting. He has even commissioned a sketch of the missing spoon from a palace miniaturist to aid the investigation. The resulting image, rendered in careful ink strokes with annotated dimensions, shows the spoon to be about 17.8 centimeters in length, with a flattened fig-shaped bowl and twisted handle design popular under the Macedonian dynasty. Interestingly, this visual record spawns its own form of confusion. Some claim the spoon shown is too ornate to be a third table item. Others assert that it matches an older set, decommissioned during the reign of Emperor Michael III. A small circle of scholar clerks now debate whether the missing spoon had been improperly reassigned, and thus perhaps never meant to be where it went missing. If so, then the spoon is not lost, but miscategorized. This hypothesis introduces a new layer of complexity. The Byzantine administration, famed for its interlocking hierarchies, often maintained multiple overlapping records. Each department, treasury, protocol, liturgy, kept its own inventory, each with subtle differences in terminology, categorization, or scope. Thus, a single spoon might be recorded 3 different ways, under 3 separate codes, depending on its ceremonial use, material value, or imperial association. To resolve this, a council is formed, 3 senior clerks from the Kubuklian, imperial wardrobe and interior offices, 2 eunuch stewards, and a retired palace archivist named Alexios, who reportedly once tracked down a misfiled sandal belonging to Basil I after 17 years. They combed through decades of linen scrolls and bound codices, seeking anomalies. In the records for a feast during Pentecost 4 years earlier, they find a scribal mark beside a silver spoon entry, 2 vertical lines in red ink, meaning item under reassignment. But no follow-up record exists. Did the reassignment ever occur? Meanwhile, down in the laundry cellars beneath the palace, servants are instructed to inspect the cleaning bundles. Towels, cloths, ceremonial covers, and napkins are aired out, examined by candlelight. Nothing. The senior laundry mistress, a sharp-eyed widow named Cashin, suggests checking the insides of velvet utensil pouches. Each spoon was stored in one when not in use. Some pouches, she reminds them, were made with double linings during a particularly luxurious phase of Basil II's reign, and so they are checked one by one. On the 6th day of this phase of the search, an apprentice in the laundry room lets out a quiet gasp. He has found something, wedged in the inner seam of a fraying velvet pouch long thought retired. It is the missing spoon, slightly tarnished, but intact. Its reappearance sends ripples through the court. The spoon is not immediately returned to its storage tray. Instead, it is placed on a velvet cloth atop a marble pedestal in the palace chapel, where it remains for a full day and night under oil lamp vigil. A short Thanksgiving service is held, led by a subdeacon who gives thanks for the return of this small but faithful servant of order. Then comes the rectification. This is not merely an act of shelving. The return of the spoon must be reintegrated into the broader system. Its reentry is logged in 3 separate registers. A new tag is affixed to its handle, a thin bronze band engraved with its full inventory title and the date of its recovery. A marginal note is added to the registry. Returned from obscurity on the feast of Saint Euphemia, the steward is formally cleared of negligence. The reassigned scullery maid is reinstated. A small note is sent, via ornate scroll, to the delegation from Trebizond. The banquet is now rescheduled, the tables will be set again, and all will proceed according to proper liturgical and diplomatic sequence. And the spoon? It is placed carefully back among its brethren, third from the left beside its twin, which had looked a little off balance without it. The table once again shines in mirrored perfection. The folds of the linen napkins seem sharper. The goblets gleam. But even as the spoon is restored, a question lingers. If such a small thing can bring the wheels of empire to a halt, how many more threads hold the Byzantine world together? Fragile, overlooked, and one misplacement away from chaos. The banquet is held at last. Candles flicker against golden mosaics. Courtiers murmur into goblets of honeyed wine. And on the table, neither centerpiece nor afterthought, rests the once-lost silver spoon. No special mention is made of it, and yet its presence is felt, like the final note of a long and complicated hymn settling into silence. You might think the spoon's return would end the matter. But this is Byzantium. In the weeks following the incident, the Imperial Secretariat quietly issues a new procedural memorandum on the proper maintenance and audit of table implements in service to the Chrysotriclinos and affiliated halls. It is 13 pages long, bound in purple-stamped parchment, and includes an addendum on the acceptable tolerances for spoon curvature wear. The memo includes these updates. All serving spoons are to be weighed monthly. Cloth pouches must be stitched with visible seams. Any silver implement found misaligned in its tray must be reported, even if not missing. A quarterly recitation audit is now required for the fourth table as well as the third. The policy is meticulous. It reflects the Byzantine obsession with codification. But it also reflects something deeper. The idea that perfection, once disrupted, must be overcorrected to reaffirm control. Across the palace, minor administrators begin to panic. If a spoon could cause this much disruption, what might happen if an incense ladle went uncounted? Or a wine sieve misplaced? Suddenly, there is a surge in parchment orders as clerks double-record every copper skewer and ceremonial plate. Laundry pouches are catalogued by weave type. The candle room steward proposes adding wax seal verification to oil lamp wicks. In a strange way, the spoon has made the empire more Byzantine. But not everyone is displeased. Some see opportunity in the chaos. One steward, previously considered too young for promotion, gains notoriety for proposing a cross-departmental utensil tagging system, eventually earning a minor honorific. A former scribe pens a didactic poem, The Lost Spoon's Return, which circulates among palace staff as a parable on diligence and redemption. Even the clergy take note. A homily delivered in the Hagia Irene draws parallels between the lost spoon and the parable of the lost coin, suggesting that even the smallest vessels of our service, when restored, bring joy to the angels and order to the realm. The analogy may be a stretch, but in Byzantium, theology bends easily toward bureaucracy. Some months later, the original spoon is quietly rotated out of service. It is placed in a sealed case, now considered both sacred and suspect. A new spoon, identical in form, but engraved with a tiny cross within a square, is commissioned to replace it. This way, should another spoon go missing, it will bear a mark. And the retired spoon? It's kept in a secure cabinet, not far from imperial relics. A feather said to be from John the Baptist's robe, a ceramic bowl claimed to have caught oil at the miracle of Myra, and a cracked drinking vessel once used by Emperor Theophilos during a summer siege. No one visits it often, but it remains labeled, categorized, sealed, proof that even a spoon, once misplaced, can shape the rhythms of an empire. As time passes, the story of the spoon is told and retold. It becomes a cautionary tale for new clerks, a training exercise for scribes, a memory whispered by palace laundresses folding linen with extra care. And centuries later, long after the empire itself has vanished, the inventory scroll that recorded its loss survives, tucked into the archives of a Venetian merchant, misfiled under religious tracts. The spoon is never mentioned by name, of course, only by position, weight, and ceremonial use. But the detail is unmistakable. Restored from error, fitted again into the order of things. Therein lies the legacy. The spoon mattered not because it was silver, but because it was known, counted, folded into ritual, placed just so. In the Byzantine worldview, every object had its place, every place had its meaning, and meaning itself was a form of control. To misplace a spoon was to let the world slip slightly out of alignment. And to find it again was not just to restore a table, but to reassert the empire's great illusion, that all things, large and small, were in order. Imagine a misty dawn in the rolling hills of northern England, around the year 1273. You are standing outside a Cistercian abbey, stone walls soot-streaked, bells echoing faintly across the valley. Inside, the monks have already sung the first office of the day, lauds, and now quietly file out to begin their daily duties. Some head to the kitchens, others to the scriptorium. And a few, marked by their rougher cloaks and stiff gait, are heading to the sheep. These are the conversi, lay brothers who perform the physical labor that keeps the abbey running. Their chief duty? Tending to the abbey's wool-producing flock. The sheep, you see, are not merely animals here. They are the economic backbone of monastic life. And the monks, contrary to the serene image often evoked by candlelit chanting, spend much of their time counting them. Not metaphorically, literally. Medieval monasteries were deeply invested in wool production, particularly in England and northern France. Abbeys such as Fountains, Rievaulx, and Clairvaux became major players in the European wool trade. Their flocks could number in the thousands, spread across dozens of pastures and granges. Each sheep represented money, sustenance, parchment, and even political leverage. And so the monks counted, not once, not casually, but obsessively. You might be surprised to learn how methodical these men were. Far from being quaint or bumbling, their record-keeping was remarkably precise, sometimes surpassing that of secular estates. In wax tablets and parchment rolls, they logged sheep by age, breed, wool quality, and pasture location. There were separate tallies for rams, ewes, wethers, castrated males raised for wool, and lambs. Some records even note birth order and fleece consistency. A surviving inventory from Moe Abbey, Yorkshire, 1286, lists sheep numbers by fold, the temporary pens where sheep slept at night. The entries read like this: Fold of St. Guthlac, 112 ewes, 4 rams, 15 lambs. Fold of Blessed Mary, 87 wethers, 3 injured, 2 suspected for culling. Fold of the Hill Grange, 163 total, wool clipped 3 days prior. At the core of these records is the need for consistency. A single miscount could lead to lost revenue or worse, suspicions of theft. So how did monks keep track? The answer: systems. Boring, brilliant, and incredibly detailed systems. Each morning, before sunrise, lay brothers and hired herdsmen would perform a roll call, a verbal and visual count, moving sheep from fold to pasture. Using shepherd's crooks and marked stones or wooden tallies, they'd record changes in herd size. A sheep marked with colored chalk might be noted as pending for illness. A lamb found dead, a frequent occurrence, would be recorded immediately, its carcass examined to determine cause: disease, wolf, or accident. These tallies were passed on to the cellarer or granatorius, the monk in charge of provisioning and trade. He would copy them into a parchment ledger, cross-referencing with the prior week's numbers. One particularly diligent monk at Rievaulx Abbey added notes in the margins. The ewe with the black spot on shoulder again strayed, must bind fence with thorn. Sheep counting wasn't just economic, it was seasonal. In spring, lambing began. The monks kept vigil overnight during the peak weeks, assisting with births and marking newborns with thread loops around their necks. In summer came shearing. Shearers, often hired laymen, worked under supervision in long stone barns called shearing sheds. The fleece was weighed, bundled, and stored in wax sacks. Monks counted the bundles not just for trade, but to ensure none went missing in transit. And in winter, when flocks thinned due to cold and wolves, the counts became grimly repetitive. Dead at dawn for, a record might say, eaten, one, by dogs of Sir Geoffrey's men. To avoid errors, some abbeys devised mnemonic systems. A monk might chant a counting psalm, assigning each number a verse. 1. O Lord, you are God. 2. The Testaments. 3. The Trinity. Not for piety alone, but because rhythm helped memory. Tools helped too. Small abacuses were used, pebbles placed in grooves similar to Roman counting boards. Later in the 13th century, tally sticks became common. notched pieces of wood marking debts and inventories. Some monks even carved small animal-shaped tokens to represent certain flocks, storing them in leather pouches for quick accounting. But mistakes happened. Lambs were miscounted. Wolves took more than expected. Or, most frustratingly, sheep were simply gone. The entries reflected missing, perhaps in marsh, or unaccounted, presumed taken. Some abbots issued fines to shepherds. Others invoked prayer. A few invoked both. And then there was sleep. You may have wondered, did monks count sheep to fall asleep, as we imagine today? Strangely, the association might not be far-fetched. There are references in several 14th century pastoral manuals that recommend rhythmic enumeration of sheep at night, not for relaxation, but as a meditative task to avoid impure thoughts. One reads, "When restless, let the brother number the lambs of his fold, for their order is of the Lord, and in it the devil finds no foothold." So perhaps, in flickering candlelight, as the wind moaned through cloisters, a weary monk did indeed lie on his straw mattress and murmur, "One ewe, 2 lambs, 3. And yet, despite all these records, these counting systems, and layers of organization, a basic truth remained. Sheep had a mind of their own. They wandered, they bleated, they vanished, and the monks, ever patient, would go out again at dawn with tablets and tallies, ready to count again. But what happened when the numbers simply didn't add up? The year is now 1274, and winter has melted into an early, soggy spring. You are standing with a monk named Brother Edric, hunched beneath his woolen cowl, as he scans a hillside dotted with damp sheep. He carries no sword, no staff of office, only a wax tablet and a satchel full of tally sticks, each etched with delicate notches. His task is simple, yet deceptively fraught, to find out why there are 3 fewer lambs than the previous week's record states. This isn't unusual. Flocks fluctuate. Predators, illness, and accidents reduce numbers every season. But in a Cistercian monastery, where every sheep is worth a fraction of God's order, 3 missing lambs might just spark a quiet administrative reckoning. Brother Edric is not panicked. Yet, he's methodical. He begins by walking to the far fold, a temporary wooden pen used during lambing season. He counts again, still short. Then he checks the ledger. It reads, "Fold of St. Sebastian, 18 ewes. Lambs birthed this month, 23. Lambs surviving to this week, 21. And yet, only 18 are present today." It's not just the numbers that don't match. It's the story they tell. Something's wrong. At this point in monastic sheep management, such discrepancies trigger a formal response. The monastery's economic system, known as the customals, includes not only counting procedures but also investigative pathways. If numbers fail to reconcile after 3 attempts, the issue is brought to the attention of the cellarer and noted in the liber computi, or account book. Edric must now escalate. He walks the half-mile to the grange steward's hut and reports the anomaly. The steward, another lay brother, tightens his lips and begins drafting a memorandum. A full flock recount will be performed, including comparison to the parchment ledger, the wax tablets, and the steward's own personal annotations from the last shearing season. These overlapping documents are a hallmark of monastic administration. Unlike secular estate managers, who often relied on seasonal tallies or memory, monks wrote everything down. Not because they lacked faith, but because they feared chaos. Each entry, each little mark on parchment, was a safeguard against disorder. Counting sheep wasn't just about economics. It was about maintaining harmony between human effort, divine providence, and the wild unpredictability of nature. Still, miscounts were common. The documents tell us this. Surviving ledgers from English abbeys record missing sheep not with alarm, but with weary resignation. "Lost to marsh," reads one. "Presumed taken by dogs," reads another. One entry from Tintern Abbey is particularly blunt. "Gone, reason unknown. The Lord knows." And sometimes the Lord did intervene, at least on paper. A curious letter from a monk at Byland Abbey records the miraculous return of a lamb previously counted as lost. "It came again, limping but whole," he writes. The event is carefully recorded in both the economic tally and the annual spiritual annals, a dual ledger of body and soul. One lamb, two stories. But more often, the discrepancies were mundane. Lambs wandered into gullies. They slipped under hedgerows. They got mixed in with neighboring flocks. That, too, had a solution: border accounting. Abbeys bordering each other often kept shared records of sheep movement. The monks of Revo and Fountains, for example, maintained a seasonal mutual agreement. If a sheep crossed the stream that divided their lands, it was tagged with colored yarn and returned at the next market reconciliation. These reconciliations were small affairs. A few monks, some wine, and a great deal of bleeding. At the heart of all this was an intense respect for the ledger. To a modern observer, a monk's life might seem contemplative and prayerful, and indeed it was. But many monks spent equal time with styluses and ink, ensuring the monastery's economic engine continued to run. Flocks meant wool, wool meant coin, coin meant books, repairs, and, yes, alms to the poor. And so a missing lamb wasn't merely a farm issue, it was a theological one. It hinted at slackness, a flaw in the pattern. To restore order, monasteries developed what might be called flock audits. Once per quarter, the abbot or his representative would walk the granges, not just to check sheep but to inspect records. Ledger against wax, tablet against tally, brother against brother in the most civil sense. During one such audit, it was discovered that a monk at Melrose Abbey had been over-reporting his flock by precisely 6 sheep. Not to profit, he gained nothing personally, but out of pride. He wanted his pasture to seem the most productive. The punishment? A month of silence, 2 weeks of cold meals, and a public confession read aloud during chapter. Yet for all their precision, monks also understood that some things were beyond record. In the margins of ledgers, you'll find notes, gentle, poetic, and deeply human. One lamb died in cold, buried near the yew tree. Yew marked with cross on back gave birth after feast of St. Stephen. Lamb with crooked leg walks better now. Kept him near chapel. These notes rarely affected the bottom line, but they were kept. Why? Perhaps because the monks, in their quiet observance, understood that not all order is numerical. That some parts of the world, even a world built on counting, needed tenderness. Back to Brother Edric. By now, he's completed the recount. The lambs are still missing. But as he returns to the abbey's main hall, a stable boy runs up with a story. 3 lambs were found near the edge of the marsh, tangled in briar but alive. The numbers add up again. The entry in the Liber Computee reads simply, recovered, entangled, not lost. But the real record is written in Brother Edric's heart. A renewed understanding that even in a system of ink and tally, the sheep have their own will. The 3 lambs have been recovered. Brother Edric, with hands scratched from the brambles, returns to the scriptorium that evening. The other monks are already at their desks, copying psalms, sermons, or tax documents. He quietly picks up his wax tablet and records a single line. Entangled, not lost. It's a phrase that lingers, more poetic than practical. And yet it encapsulates much of what defined the monk's relationship to sheep, to labor, and to the quiet, careful pursuit of divine order through daily routine. Because it wasn't just about livestock. It was about creating a world in which numbers made sense. You see, in a time before spreadsheets and filing cabinets, a monastic flock was more than a group of animals. It was a system, a metaphor, and a way of understanding the divine. Sheep were tangible symbols of stability. They could be counted. They could be sheared. They produced. They obeyed the rhythms of nature. But they also wandered. They got sick. They defied records. And so the monks counted again. Let us consider what happened next in this cycle of medieval sheepkeeping. Once the lambs were recovered and the flock stabilized, wool season approached. Shearing was a high ritual event. Monks cleaned and prepared the stone barns. They laid out wax cloths to catch fleece and dust. Each sheep was brought in, sheared by hired specialists or trained brothers, then counted again, first by head, then by weight of fleece. The wool was the abbey's primary export. It was bundled into bales, sealed with wax, and marked with the abbey's sigil. a stylized cross, a sheaf of wheat, a lamb. These bales were carted to coastal ports and shipped to merchants in Bruges, Ghent, or Florence. Cistercian wool was prized for its cleanliness and uniformity. It funded church repairs, hospital alms, and even crusade tithes. Every step of this trade was recorded. There are scrolls in dusty archives, many still intact, that list wool transactions down to the half-pound. One bundle from Fountains Abbey, sent to Bruges in 1290, is described as of even cut, white-greased, combed, and weighed. The ledger includes the number of sheep who contributed, the average fleece weight, and the name of the monk who supervised. Each number in these records stands like a tiny monument to a sheep once alive. And yet, for all this order, monks often reflected quietly in margins on the impossibility of perfection. One line from a scribe in Revo reads, "We know not how many we lost, nor where they died. The Lord shall find them." It echoes, perhaps unintentionally, the parable of the lost sheep. And that is fitting. Monks viewed their flocks as spiritual metaphors. The abbot was often called the shepherd of souls, and the flock an emblem of the monastery itself. Just as they counted sheep, they tallied their own sins and virtues. They sheared not only wool but pride, wayward thoughts, and ambition. In that sense, counting sheep wasn't only about trade, it was a spiritual discipline. A reminder that care, attention, and record-keeping were sacred. That repetition was not drudgery, but prayer. And so we return one last time to Brother Edric. He continues his rounds through the seasons. He counts lambs born in spring, hears the rasp of wool shears in summer, notes deaths in winter. He trains a younger brother to handle tally sticks. He records births, burials, and shearing yields with the same humble devotion. Years later, when his eyesight fades and his joints ache, he's relieved of daily duties. But he keeps his ledger, his own private scroll, where he writes brief observations in neat Latin script. 2 lambs born before sunrise, very small, fence held during the storm. A ewe looked at me as if knowing. Flock counted, no error, Deo gratias. Eventually, the ledger is passed on, and Brother Edric is buried under a yew near the pasture. His name is noted in the obit roll. His scroll, now dusty, is shelved and forgotten. And yet centuries later, in a climate-controlled library, a historian opens it and smiles. The sheep are long gone, but their numbers remain, their order, their absence, their unexpected reappearance. This, then, is the quiet legacy of monks who counted sheep, that in a world of noise, war, and fire, they preserved not just the wool, but the pattern, not just the fleece but the fold, not just the sheep but the shape of attention itself. The year is 1671. You are walking through the heart of Istanbul, then Constantinople, where the call to prayer drifts over tiled rooftops and the smell of roasted chestnuts and sheep fat lingers in the alleyways. You follow a narrow lane behind the Grand Bazaar and find yourself in a quieter quarter, the Carapsular Karsisi, the sockmaker's market. Here, amid piles of hand-spun wool and the rhythmic clack-clack of wooden looms, unfolds a quiet but persistent story of Ottoman daily life. The rise, regulation, and surprising cultural significance of the sock. Not a sword, not a turban, not a jeweled dagger or embroidered robe, a sock. And yet, this humble garment, stitched, dyed, traded, counted mattered immensely, for warmth, for status, and above all, for trade. Socks in the Ottoman Empire were more than utilitarian items. They were crafted objects, personal gifts, cultural indicators, and economic units. Knit or woven by hand, socks were made in wool, cotton, or sometimes silk. The wealthy commissioned custom-dyed silk socks embroidered with gold thread. The poor made do with sturdy goat wool. But everyone, soldier or scholar, shopkeeper or Sufi, wore socks. And someone had to make them. The Ottoman sock industry was vast and largely decentralized. Individual sock makers, called carapsular, worked in guilds, often organized by neighborhood or ethnicity. There were Armenian sock makers, Kurdish wool spinners, Greek dyers, and Turkish loom weavers. Many women worked in cottage industry settings, knitting socks during winter months or between other household duties. These socks would then be sold to traveling merchants, who carried them to bazaars in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Sarajevo. Socks were sorted by type and function. Ayak Yunu Korap, coarse wool socks for outdoor wear. Ins Ipek Korap, thin silk socks for indoor use or ceremonial garb. Kislik Orm Korap, thick knitted socks for winter, often dyed deep red or blue. Each type had its own pricing scale, quality standards, and regional flavor. In Istanbul, the socks were often sold from chest-height counters, stacked in bundles of 6 or 12. A clerk would pull open a drawer, remove a wrapped pair, and unfurl it with a flick of the wrist. The customer might feel the texture, stretch the ankle, or sniff it for signs of oil or mildew. A good sock was soft but not slippery, tight at the ankle, flexible at the toe. Unblemished dye and no knots in the stitching. For those with means, socks were purchased in sets, each pair dyed to match a specific robe or set of indoor slippers. Fashionable men owned as many as a dozen pairs. Wealthy women sometimes had theirs scented with rose oil or lavender before being wrapped in fine muslin. But this was not mere frippery. It was commerce, and serious commerce at that. The Ottoman government regulated the sock trade through guilds and esnaf defters, trade ledgers kept by bazaar inspectors. Prices were fixed seasonally. A complaint about price gouging could result in public scolding or even flogging. Dye quality was monitored. Sock merchants who cut corners, substituting goat wool for sheep's, for example, were fined or briefly shut down. One surviving record from 1689 details an inspection of the sock stalls near the Yeni Cami Mosque. 3 pairs found adulterated with mixed thread, punished with confiscation and ordered to repay with clean pair. Dye was weak, faded after washing. Offense minor. This level of bureaucratic attention to socks may seem excessive, but to the Ottomans, textiles were the sinews of the empire. Wool taxes funded roads. Dye monopolies fed into diplomatic gifting systems. Sock exports, yes, sock exports were part of trade networks that reached as far as Venice, Persia, and the Swahili coast. In fact, an Ottoman merchant's account book found in Thessaloniki lists sock bundles among more traditional cargo like olive oil, saffron, and dried figs. The socks were itemized by length, fiber type, and pattern. 6 pairs red silk, Damascus twist. 12 pairs wool, Bursa made. 9 pairs blue and white stripe, for gifting. Even in diplomacy, socks had their place. It was common to include finely made socks in gift sets sent to foreign dignitaries. In one recorded case, a bundle of silk socks was sent to the Polish court in 1701, along with rugs and pomegranate syrup. The note attached, written by the court translator, read, "To warm the feet, a courtesy of the Sultan's hand." But perhaps most fascinating is the personal economy of socks, the way they circulated as tokens of affection, inheritance, and spiritual favor. In marriage trousseaux, socks were carefully folded into linen bundles alongside scarves and handkerchiefs. Mothers knit socks for sons going to war. Socks were donated to dervish lodges for the poor and pilgrims. Some Sufi mystics even spoke of the path of the sock, the belief that to clothe another's feet in warmth was an act of love and humility. One tale, recorded in the notes of a Mevlevi dervish from Konya, tells of a master who knit a pair of socks for each of his students before sending them on the road to spread teachings. Each sock bore a different hidden stitch, a signature of memory. None were perfect. That, the dervish said, was the point. Back in the bazaar, as you watch a sock seller close shop for the day, he folds his stock carefully, wraps it in cotton, and locks it in a chest no larger than a laundry basket. The stall will open again tomorrow, the socks unpacked, touched, bought and worn. You might wonder, how many toes passed through these seams? How many footsteps marched across empire, warmed by a thing so small? And did anyone ever count them? Morning breaks again in the Karapsalar Karsisi, the sockmaker's market, and you return to find merchants unlocking wooden shutters and shaking dust from linen covers. Sock bundles, each tied with string or wrapped in waxed cloth, are laid gently on broad wooden counters. Nearby, a city inspector, an Itisab Agassi, adjusts his sash and prepares to walk the rows. Today is inspection day. In the Ottoman Empire, the humble sock was not exempt from regulation. Textiles were central to the state's control over both daily life and the economy. The state didn't just tax production, it monitored materials, dyes, labor rates, and even display practices. Socks might seem beneath notice, but in an empire where the fabric trade helped fund armies and mosques, no thread was truly insignificant. The inspector begins his round. He stops at a stall where bundles of red wool socks are piled neatly. He takes a pair, unfurls it, holds it up to the light, and examines the stitching. Tight? Consistent? Then, with practiced fingers, he pinches the cuff and checks the wool quality. He hands it back, nods, and makes a small notation in a leather-bound ledger known as the Defter-i Asnaf, the Register of Guilds and Goods. These defters were marvels of Ottoman bureaucratic precision. Written in a graceful, curling Ottoman Turkish script, each one listed the names of registered sock sellers, their product types, guild dues, seasonal prices, and past infractions. There was even a category for dye offenses, using watered pigment, unstable mordants, or colors not approved for public sale. One entry from 1694 reads, Ali son of Mehmet, 4th stall past Mahmutpasha gate. Complaint filed. Sock sold as indigo but dyed with mulberry bark. Ordered to display true dye bowl for verification. Warning issued. Dye fraud was no small matter. The color of a sock wasn't just aesthetic. It was economic and symbolic. Indigo, imported at great expense via India and Persia, was prized and costly. Its deep blue signaled trustworthiness, modest wealth, or even, when used in patterns, regional identity. Scarlet red, often derived from cochineal insects or madder root, was another premium tone, often reserved for winter pairs or formal wear. Yellow, curiously, was less desirable. In some quarters it was associated with illness or misfortune. Because of this, each dye was tracked carefully. Dye masters were expected to register their bowls and display color swatches on small parchment tags. Sock makers often hung dyed thread samples on strings above their stalls, creating a soft, fluttering banner of promise and proof. But beneath the public display, something subtler emerged. Sock patterns began to carry codes. In remote parts of Anatolia and the Balkans, especially where villagers knit socks for sale in the urban markets, distinct regional patterns developed, not just for beauty but for function. A zigzag meant durability. A small cross pattern stitched inside the ankle might signal newlyweds. A vertical line along the heel meant blessed for travel. A quiet marketing claim as much as a charm. Some patterns were even prayers. Among Sufi communities, socks were sometimes knitted with alternating dark and light rows, symbolizing the soul's journey through hardship and ease. These were gifted during initiation rites or worn by dervishes on long pilgrimages. A few dervish lodges kept sock-weaving rooms, where novices learned to spin wool and meditate as they knit. In women's households, the codes became more private. Mothers stitched small flowers into children's socks to ward off sickness. A broken diamond pattern in the toe might mean the wearer was in mourning. These details were rarely recorded in defters or formal trade documents, but they appear in surviving artifacts, in embroidery glossaries passed down through generations, and in oral histories collected by textile scholars. What did this mean for trade? Everything. Merchants learned to recognize region by pattern. A 3-row chevron? Erzurum. Bold ankle spirals in blue and white? Likely Bursa. Socks became maps in themselves, woven charts of identity, need, and style. And for the meticulous Ottoman administrators, this growing complexity presented a challenge. How to catalog a product so personal yet so common? The answer was compromise. Markets enforced quality and pricing, but left much of the interior decoration alone. As long as the sock met its weight, color fastness, and stitch requirements, a little mystery was acceptable. That mystery, of course, was what kept the trade alive. A 1712 merchant logbook from Edirne lists socks sold not by exact type, but by nickname: the bride's hope, white with blue stripe; the traveler's rest, gray with stitched foot cushion; little lion, children's size, warm wool, bold red toe. These names didn't appear in ledgers, but they were what customers remembered. And what of the makers? Most sock makers, especially those outside the major cities, remained anonymous. Their work was untagged, their names unrecorded. But some became known for their distinctive style or stitch. In one case, a female sock knitter from Tokat was invited to Istanbul to teach her spiral stitch technique to the court's master weavers. She was paid in spices, velvet, and permission to sell her socks tax-free for a year. Her name is lost, but the stitch endures in museum pieces today. Meanwhile, socks kept walking. Soldiers wore them on marches into Persia and the Balkans. Merchants packed them into trade trunks beside pistachios and honey cakes. Courtiers gifted them to clerks during Ramadan. Pilgrims carried them to Mecca. Travelers stuffed them with coins for safekeeping. And yet, through it all, a curious fact remains. Socks rarely survived. Used daily, washed harshly, worn to threads, they rarely made it into the historical record. What we know of them comes from drawings, ledgers, a few precious textiles preserved in dry climates, and, most vividly, from the paper trail of bureaucracy. Perhaps that is the oddest legacy of the Ottoman sock. Not that it warmed toes, but that it left behind so many pages. And so, one might ask, in a market where patterns were whispered and stitches uncounted, how did the empire ever keep track of so many feet? Evening settles over the sock seller's quarter. The sun sinks behind the domes of Istanbul, casting a bronze light over the tiled roofs and wooden shutters of the bazaar. Merchants are folding away their wares, candles flicker in the tailors' shops, and the cobbled alleys echo with the faint shuffle of slippers worn thin at the heel. Somewhere in a side street off the Grand Bazaar, an elderly Karapsai, sockmaker, named Yusuf finishes tying a bundle of woolen socks with cotton twine. He stacks it gently with a dozen others, bound for Konya, perhaps, or Skopje, and places it in a broad wicker basket. Then, as he has done for nearly 40 years, he opens the guild ledger to log his day's work. It's a ritual he learned from his master. A slow, deliberate act. He dips the pen in ink, writes the quantity, color, and thread weight. He marks the initials of his apprentice. Then, in the margin, as many old Karapsalar do, he adds a brief, personal line. Knitted while the rain fell. This quiet moment, the ledger, the socks, the weather, is where our story comes to rest. Because by the mid-18th century, the Ottoman sock trade, while still vital, was beginning to change. Not collapse, just shift. Slowly, gently, like thread unwinding from a spindle. Several forces converged. First, the expansion of factory-produced textiles from Europe, particularly from Britain and Italy, began to challenge the handmade economy of the bazaar. While machine-knit socks didn't immediately replace the hand-woven kinds, they created pricing pressure. Foreign goods, sometimes smuggled or imported under favorable trade deals, began appearing in Ottoman ports. Second, the Ottoman bureaucracy, so meticulous, so thorough, began to strain under its own weight. Registers grew thicker. Oversight became sluggish. Inspections slowed. By 1772, complaints in merchant circles increased. Foreign socks labeled as local, dyes watered down without punishment, guild dues misrecorded. A letter from a sock merchant in Bursa laments. The bazaar is full, yet I do not know half the sellers. The old signs are gone. The red dyes bleed. The thread comes loose. No one counts anymore. Third, and perhaps most importantly, cultural taste began to shift. Young men in urban centers started favoring imported footwear, leather boots, heeled shoes, ankle-length slippers. These styles required different socks. Thinner, tighter, simpler. The elaborately patterned, hand-knit ankle socks of the previous generation became peasant wear in elite circles. Rural communities still prized them, but the prestige faded. Even language changed. The poetic sock names faded from ledgers. Merchants began referring to products in numerical codes. The beautiful ambiguity of the bride's hope became item 17B, red wool, medium gauge. Yet even in this decline, the memory endured. Guilds remained, though smaller. Some merged. The Karapsalar Longkasai, Sockmakers Guild, in Istanbul was eventually absorbed into the larger Ayakkabıcılar, Shoemakers, Guild. Apprenticeship traditions continued, though fewer boys chose the path. Record-keeping persisted, but became increasingly formal and personal. But in homes, particularly in the countryside, the story was different. Women continued to knit socks for family and sale. Patterns were passed down quietly, sometimes altered, sometimes preserved stitch for stitch. Rural markets still prized local socks, and religious festivals remained full of gifted pairs, handed from mother to daughter, from elder to bride. Some village socks included blessings stitched into the heel. Others hid a single-colored thread, green for health, red for luck, black for protection. These codes weren't written anywhere, but every family knew them. And, curiously, the poetic sock names survived longest not in Istanbul, but in Anatolia and the Balkans. Ethnographers collecting textile samples in the late 19th century recorded names like moonstep, thin socks for nighttime walking; rose wrap, a wedding day pair, worn once; orphan's flame, a gift for a child who had lost a parent; journey clothes, travel socks, often packed in a bundle with dried bread and almonds. These names whispered of memory, warmth, hope. Even in the modern age, traces remain. In some Istanbul museums, you can still see 17th and 18th century Ottoman socks. Tiny, curled, discolored but intricate. Their thread count is astonishing. Some have dyed heels. Others include a stitched flower on the instep, almost hidden. Perhaps a secret code, or just a touch of joy. Historians speculate about the people who made them. Were they women knitting between harvests, men weaving by oil lamp, children watching and learning from the corner? We do not know their names, but we know the socks they made. And in that way, they're not lost. The Ottoman Empire was vast, stretching across continents, cultures, and centuries. It built mosques, minted coins, rewrote calendars. But it also wove socks. Millions of them. Soft, quiet, daily things. Worn and worn through. Folded, bundled, traded, gifted, remembered. And now, when we remember the empire, not just its sultans or sieges, but its people, we might think of their feet. Warm, covered, walking across tiled floors, bazaars, prayer halls, and frozen fields. All wrapped in a humble, hand-stitched fold of thread. It is 1838 in Paris. The Seine flows quietly under weathered stone bridges. Chimneys send ribbons of smoke into the gray morning air. A horse-drawn cart clatters along the cobblestones. Inside, a stack of bread loaves, round, firm, and dusted with flour, rests under burlap, bound for a cafe not yet open. But behind this stillness lies a quiet unrest. A slow-baking rebellion, if you will. You step into a boulangerie in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine district. The walls are warm from the heat of the brick oven. The air is thick with the smell of yeast, wood smoke, and scorched flour. It's a little after 4 in the morning, and the bakers are just finishing their night shift. Their eyes are puffy, their arms dusted white, and for the past several months, they've been muttering about a most curious form of protest. Not about wages, not even about the cost of flour, but about naps. Yes, naps. This is the story of how French bakers, among the most respected craftsmen of the 19th century, reached their breaking point not over political manifestos or hunger, but because they weren't allowed to sleep when their bodies most needed to. To understand the protest, you must first understand the schedule. Baking bread in 1830s Paris was not a job. It was a life. The average master baker rose around 1 a.m. His apprentices, often teenage boys, rose even earlier. The dough had to be mixed by hand, allowed to rise in the cool night air, shaped, scored, and fired in a wood-burning oven that could take hours to reach the proper heat. By 6 a.m., the first loaves would go out, carried in wicker baskets across the city. This meant working through the night every night except Sundays. Bakers slept in short naps, usually 1 or 2 hours at a time. But in the 1830s, city inspectors began enforcing new health ordinances that encouraged continuous operation, discouraging what they called slovenly resting hours between batches. The problem? Those slovenly hours were the only sleep the bakers got. At first, the bakers grumbled privately. They adjusted. They added stronger coffee to their diets. But as months passed, Fatigue turned to anger. Their hands ached. Their tempers flared. Loaves were burnt. Apprentices fainted. The master bakers of Paris began talking, over wine, in backrooms, and most daringly through pamphlets. One of these, titled Du repos et du pain, of rest and bread, circulated quietly among the baking guilds in 1839. It read, in part, "We feed the city. We rise before the street sweepers and sleep after the last lamplighter. Is a man not entitled to lay down beside his oven without shame?" That phrase, "without shame," became the rallying cry. By the spring of 1840, a handful of bakeries in the Latin Quarter began experimenting with what the press would later call the grève deceases, the nap strike. But this wasn't a strike against napping. It was a strike for the right to nap. Master bakers locked their front doors for exactly 90 minutes in the early afternoon. They pinned signs in the windows that read, "Closed for dignity. Sleeping like honest men." It was an oddly specific protest. No marches, no placards, just naps. Intentional, unapologetic naps. City officials were bemused. Some shopkeepers laughed. But others, particularly workers in adjacent trades like butchery, fishmongering, and laundry, took note. These were also professions built on pre-dawn labor. And the bakers, through their sleepy act of defiance, were voicing a universal grievance: the empire of fatigue. The municipal council responded with cautious disapproval. They didn't outlaw naps outright, but inspectors were told to monitor irregular bakery closures. One report filed in April 1840 notes, "Boulangerie of Rue du Church-Midi observed shuttered at 2:10 p.m. Baker claimed he was in pursuit of restorative repose. Not fined." Warned sternly, bakers held their ground. Some began including nap periods in their shop signage. Open from 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., closed 2 to 3:30. Open again until dusk. Bread, rest, and honor. The newspapers, of course, had a field day. Le Figaro ran a column mocking the bakers' slumber rebellion, dubbing them les pains dormants, a pun on pain dormant, or sleeping bread. Another paper ran a cartoon of a baker snoring into a mixing bowl, dough rising gently beneath his cheek. But the satire belied a growing sympathy. Letters to the editor poured in, mostly from working-class readers. One letter from a seamstress named Louise wrote, "My baker sleeps so that I may eat. Let him sleep. Let them all sleep." The nap strike, never formally organized, spread in quiet waves. Some bakers adjusted shifts to allow naps in turn. Others adopted a full midday closure. One bakery reportedly placed a cot in the storefront window and staged a nap as a daily demonstration. The city, faced with little legal justification to interfere, chose to look the other way. And the result? The bread kept coming. Fewer loaves burned. Apprentices stayed healthier. And gradually, the protest softened into policy. By 1842, the Bakers' Guild formally amended its operating norms to include a recommended rest period between 2 o'clock and 4 p.m. Not mandatory, not enforceable, but legitimized. Some called it the siesta of the furnace. What began as exhaustion had become reform. But the story doesn't end there. Because as schedules stabilized and loaves regained consistency, another debate emerged. Should naps be logged in the bakery ledger? After all, if bread rises, why not men? It is now 1842 in Paris. The nap strikes have slowed, but their flour-dusted fingerprints remain all over the capital's boulangeries. More than a protest, they have become custom. Quiet, unspoken, and folded into the rhythms of daily life like a napkin over a warm baguette. And yet, for those who lived through the revolt, the question still simmers just under the crust. How does one account for rest? To the municipal clerks who track shop hours, productivity is measured in ovens fired and loaves delivered. To the bakers, however, sleep is part of production. Without it, the bread falters. Dough ferments too quickly. Scoring is uneven. Crusts harden. Crumbs turn dry. Napless bread is, quite literally, bad bread. So some bakers began logging naps in their ledgers. This wasn't entirely new. Since the early 18th century, many master bakers kept livres de four, oven books, where they recorded firewood usage, bake times, temperature estimates, and dough yields. But now, a few added notations like rested between 1345 and 1520, refired oven at 1530, slept poorly, loaf 3 slightly overproofed, will reduce rise tomorrow. Others adopted a more poetic tone. One famed baker in Montmartre, Monsieur Baptiste Leroy, wrote, La pâte dort, et moi aussi. The dough sleeps and so do I. These records did more than mark time. They legitimized sleep as part of the baking process, alongside water ratios and oven ash management. A well-rested baker became part of the recipe, and apprentices were taught not only how to shape a batard, but when to rest their backs between batches. Apprenticeship and sleep hygiene. The nap strikes had a profound effect on how bakeries trained their apprentices. Before the strikes, apprentices, often boys between 12 and 16, were notoriously overworked, rising before 2 a.m., kneading hundreds of kilograms of dough, hauling flour sacks, and stoking ovens with oak and beech logs. Many slept standing up, leaning against a cool wall while the dough proofed. After the strikes, a shift occurred. Guild manuals revised training schedules. Some masters built rest time into the apprentices' rota. A few pioneering bakeries even installed cots or hammocks in unused flour storage areas. A 1845 Manuel du Jeune Boulanger, Manual for the Young Baker, includes the following passage. One must honor the body as well as the crust. An exhausted hand yields bitter bread. Let the boy sleep if he is to rise with strength. This marked a sea change not only in labor culture, but in the philosophy of work itself. The baker was no longer a machine of flour and fire. He was human, and therefore worthy of rhythm. It may sound quaint, but for many working-class professions, this kind of embedded rest acknowledgement was radical. Industrialization had created the notion of ceaseless work. The bakers of Paris quietly resisted it, not by walking out but by lying down. The parallels between baking and rest became part of the professional vernacular. The proofing of dough, long seen as a passive waiting period, was reimagined as an active phase. Let the dough rise became not just instruction but advice. Rest wasn't idleness, it was fermentation. One bakery's blackboard famously bore the phrase, Même le pain ainsi repose. Even the bread rests. And so, nap culture embedded itself into French baking not as laziness, but as craftsmanship. A sign of control. A rhythm as essential as flour-to-water ratio. Master bakers now scheduled their days with balance. 1 a.m. dough preparation. 2:30 a.m. first kneading. 4 a.m. first bake. 7 a.m. deliveries. 9 a.m. cleaning, sourdough management. 14 to 15:30 rest or light sleep. 1600 hours onward. Afternoon batch for cafés and late orders. This schedule was informally adopted across Paris. It later appeared in regional bakers' journals, gradually influencing norms in Lyon, Marseille, and even parts of Belgium and Switzerland. The nap reform also affected the physical design of bakeries. Some master bakers began building chambers de repos, small nap rooms next to the ovens. These weren't luxurious. A straw mattress, a cloth curtain, sometimes just a bench beside the fire pit. But they were intentional, recognized, respected. The Parisian architect Eugène Mouton, who specialized in bakery design, advocated for these spaces in an 1846 pamphlet, A Room for Bread, a Room for Rest. Both are necessary to nourish the city. In larger bakeries, particularly those servicing hotels or markets, nap areas were rotated in shifts. Some even kept a shared wool blanket, passed down like a uniform. And in the most sentimental corners of this profession, nap logs became legacies. An apprentice who logged his nap hours with care, noting not just time but dreams, aches, or thoughts, might later pass that ledger to his son. One such book, now preserved in a provincial bakery museum in Tours, includes the final entry. Last day of dough. I have trained the boy. He will nap now in my place. By the 1850s, the nap protest was largely forgotten by name, but remembered in practice. It had worked not by revolution, but by repetition. the quiet folding of arms behind flour-smeared heads, the coals dimming low, the city pausing just for an hour or two. And what, in the end, did the bakers gain? Not riches, not holidays, but recognition. That to rise early, one must also rest. That a man who feeds a city deserves a corner of quiet. That a loaf, like a body, cannot rise without stillness. The Parisian afternoon settles into stillness. The smell of baked bread still lingers in the air, now mingled with a trace of soap and warm milk. The boulangeries along Rue de l'Abbé Grégoire and Rue Saint-Honoré begin preparing their final bakes of the day. Behind the ovens, there is a brief moment of calm, perhaps a sip of lukewarm coffee, a lengthening of the spine, a shared sigh among co-workers. This too is legacy. By the late 19th century, the story of the Nap strike had faded from headlines and political memory, but it remained, folded neatly into the fabric of everyday life. Bakers no longer called it protest. They called it routine. They called it the middle hour. As factories rose around Paris, churning out mechanized bread with uniform crusts and no sleep in sight, artisan bakers held onto their rhythms. Apprentices still whispered about grieved deceases. The Nap strike, though few could agree on when it began. Some said it started with the guild. Others with a single man in the 7th arrondissement who laid down beside his dough one Tuesday afternoon and refused to rise until the city changed with him. But what mattered wasn't the origin. It was the outcome. Nap periods became common not just in Paris, but across the provinces, Lille, Reims, Clermont-Ferrand. Not every bakery adopted them, but those that did noted subtle gains. Fewer injuries, better proofing accuracy, more consistent crusts. A rest made a better loaf. The dough knew it. The bakers knew it. And so did the community. Customers adjusted, too. They stopped knocking on doors between 2 o'clock and 4 p.m. They learned to order ahead. Signs in bakery windows began to incorporate rest with pride. Heures d'ouverture, 5H, 14H, 16H, 20H. Entrée temps, nous rêvons de pain. In between, we dream of bread. It became not just acceptable, but charming. There's a peculiar peace that settles over a community that pauses. Not just for sleep, but for slowness. While industrialized sectors of Paris raced toward 12-hour shifts and steam-powered precision, the bakeries, strange, flower-covered temples, preserved a different clock. The baker's clock, a little irregular, a little warm around the edges. When urban planners studied productivity in tradespeople in the 1880s, one curious result stood out. Bakers who incorporated short, protected rest periods showed better year-round output than those who did not. Their apprentices stayed longer. Their customers were more loyal. Their loaves were, though the report did not quantify it, more agreeable to the touch and taste. By the turn of the century, this rhythm had seeped into culture. In the 1904 edition of Le Manuel du Bon Commerçant, a chapter on merchant morale begins. A rested merchant is a good merchant. Even the baker, he who rises with the stars, must yield to the sun's slow crossing and find a pillow between the proofs. In 1910, the city of Paris passed an ordinance encouraging small business owners to provide rest spaces for employees working early shifts. The language was soft, encouraged, if space allows. But the intent was clear. The bakers had won in the most indirect and enduring way possible. They hadn't petitioned. They had simply closed their eyes. The ordinance's effects were modest, but symbolic. A few larger boulangeries renovated. Some added curtains, others used spare pantry rooms for folding cots. One progressive bakery on Rue de Vaugirard installed a rotating nap schedule with sign-in chalkboards. The youngest apprentice always got the first nap, a new tradition born from the old one. And among bakers themselves, nap etiquette became a kind of quiet wisdom. Wake your peer gently. Leave your apron folded. Never disturb a man with flour on his eyelashes. Not every bakery observed these customs. Chain stores and mechanized dough processors began to emerge in the mid-20th century, running on electric mixers and fluorescent lights. There was no nap time in the supermarket bakery aisle. But in the small shops, especially in rural France, traces of the nap culture endured. A closed shutter in the afternoon. A handwritten sign. Gone to rest. Loaves await. One baker in Avignon, interviewed in 1972, put it best. A good loaf takes time. So does the man who makes it. And in that small, unhurried truth lies the real victory of the nap strike. Not in wages won or laws passed, but in a cultural permission to rest, to pause, to treat sleep not as surrender, but as part of the recipe. Today, when you walk past a bakery and see the lights dimmed and the smell of fresh dough curling under the door, you might imagine someone behind the counter. Feet up, apron loosened, dreaming of flower fields. Not lazy, not idle, just folded in rest, like the linen over rising dough. And you might wonder, in your own life, what would happen if we treated rest as a craft? The year is 1467. In the gentle haze of early morning, the streets of Kyoto lie cool and silent. The bamboo leaves are still damp with dew. Somewhere in the eastern district, a wooden shutter creaks open, and a man named Saburo steps outside, stretches his aching shoulders, and lifts a small, flat wooden sign onto a hook above his doorway. On it, in clean brush strokes, sandal mending shop. Saburo is a kutsusher, a shoemaker, or more precisely, a sandal maker and repairer. In the Muromachi period of Japan, his job is simple, slow, and, to some, a little invisible. He does not craft armor. He does not tend temples. He makes zori and waraji, the humble sandals worn by merchants, pilgrims, monks, and messengers. He is also a diarist. We know Saburo because of a rare surviving fragment, a personal record he kept on strips of recycled paper and silk, bound roughly with string and hidden behind a wall beam in his workshop. The journal was discovered centuries later during a renovation. It contains short, quiet entries about his work, the shoes he mended, and the people whose paths he crossed. The entries are brief, rarely more than a few lines per day. But together, they form a soft chorus of 15th century life, one step at a time. Let us walk with him. March 5th, year of the fire horse. Patched 2 pairs for the monk from Honinji. Gave him extra straw. He walks far. Saburo's customers come from all walks of life, but most cannot afford new footwear. They bring him broken thongs, worn soles, and water-damaged rice straw weaves. Some sandals are made of simple twisted rope, others reinforced with strips of bamboo. Occasionally, he works on geta, the elevated clogs used in mud or snow, but mostly it's zori, flat, straw-soled sandals for walking long roads in relative silence. For a nation that prized simplicity and impermanence, shoes mattered in subtle ways. They were symbols of humility, service, and transience. And they wore out, often. Shoes weren't expected to last. The roads were rough, especially for those on pilgrimages or delivering letters. So the trade of the shoemaker was steady, if not especially revered. He repaired, reinforced, and sometimes offered a spare pair for rent, just enough to get a traveler to the next town. April 17th. Girl brought sandals with one thong gone. Said her brother runs too fast. Sewed leather scrap inside. No charge. Saburo used scraps of leather only when necessary. Leather, particularly cowhide, was a delicate material in 15th century Japan, practically and spiritually. Buddhist purity laws associated cattle with impurity. Leatherworkers often belonged to the ETA class, a marginalized group considered defiled due to their proximity to death and flesh. Saburo, however, used scraps sparingly and with quiet skill. He never spoke of where he obtained them. His diary refers only to the tanner by the river. He mostly worked with straw, hemp, bamboo fiber, and cloth. And his shop was not a shop as we think of it today. It was a small corner of his home, separated by a half wall and a bamboo curtain. Customers removed their footwear before entering. He bowed, listened, rarely spoke, and gestured toward a cushion if they wished to wait. May 9th. Traveler's waraji split across heel. He stayed for tea. Left before the bell. This simple entry reveals much. The waraji, a rice straw sandal tied to the ankle and used by travelers, was notoriously prone to splitting at the heel where pressure peaked. A good repair job could extend a pair's life by several ri. The the Japanese unit of distance. More importantly, Saburo offered tea. This wasn't part of the business. It was custom. Guests, especially weary ones, were offered weak barley tea or water with pickled plums. To offer tea while repairing a sandal was an act of respect, not for the shoe, but for the journey it carried. Some visitors stayed. Some spoke. Most didn't. Kyoto in the 1460s was a city at the edge of turmoil. The Unin War loomed just a year away, and though Saburo rarely references politics, the signs were everywhere. Refugees, ash in the air, more soldiers requesting rush repairs on their traveling sandals. July 2nd, 3 soldiers, paid in rice. 1 sandal bloodied, but I did not ask. Shoemakers like Saburo often received payment in kind. A handful of rice, a dried fish, a comb. Coinage existed but was scarce among the lower classes. Repairs were priced by size and urgency. Overnight repairs cost double, sometimes triple. But Saburo never haggled. He recorded the items, tucked them neatly into a ledger. The rice from the soldiers was left unmeasured. That was unusual. What his diary doesn't say, what it leaves silent, is just as telling. August 11th. Too hot. No work. Clean straw mats. Thought of making sandals for no one. Even in his loneliness, Saburo finds ritual. The cleaning of mats. The bundling of unused thong rope. The reshaping of sandal molds carved from ginkgo wood. Shoemakers in Kyoto weren't artists. They were craftsmen in the old sense, humble, repetitive, practical. Their names were not recorded in temple logs. Their work vanished as quickly as it was walked on. And yet, each stitch of Saburo's diary tells us something enduring. That to repair what carries another, be it a sandal, a robe, or a soul, is a quiet kind of grace. And so he records the repairs, the silence, the way the light falls on worn leather. But one wonders, what else did he never write? It is late autumn in Kyoto, 1467. The air is cooler now. A faint scent of burning pine wood drifts through the alleys. Leaves gather in red-orange clumps at the edges of stone steps. In Saburo's shop, the sandal molds are wrapped in cloth at night. He works by oil lamp, a quiet figure bent over a sandal whose heel has unraveled after a long walk from Nara. His diary, still bound with reused twine and folded paper, has grown slightly thicker. Not with philosophy, not with family gossip or national matters, but with small, meditative notes on shoes, repairs, and silence. October 3rd. Pilgrim brought sandals worn to threads. He would not sit. Smelled of smoke. I did not ask from where. The pilgrim, like many who passed through Kyoto's religious districts, likely came from war-affected regions or spiritual compounds along the Kumano route. Saburo rarely distinguishes between them. What mattered most, as always, was the state of the footwear. Worn to threads meant the sandals were finished, beyond repair. Still, he tried. Shoemakers in this period often carried a mental inventory of usable scraps. Twisted hemp, cotton remnants, bits of lacquered cord. Saburo kept his materials in neat bundles in lacquered trays marked only by feel, a technique common among craftspeople who worked in dim conditions. He was not alone in his diligence. In 15th century Japan, tradespeople who specialized in everyday tools, like comb makers, bowl carvers, and shoemakers, were part of an unspoken but essential class. Not prestigious, not powerful, but deeply respected when they practiced their work with humility and quiet excellence. This cultural current, known as shokunin kashitsu, craftsman's spirit, had no formal scripture, but shaped entire generations of work. Saburo's diary reflects this ethos, not in manifestos, but in lines like, October 18th, repaired strap with thread from old futon. Fit is strange, but the foot accepted it. October 22nd, no customers today. Rained. Practice thong knots. The knot mattered. Shoelaces were not used in this era, not in the Western sense. Japanese sandals were bound with cords of plant fiber, looped and knotted through holes punched in the sole. An uneven knot could pinch the instep or slip mid-step. Saburo practiced knots endlessly. His diary includes brief sketches, diagrams of loops and threading angles, likely drawn for apprentices who never came. He records, without bitterness, the absence of students. November 1st. Woman brought child's sandals. One broken, one missing. Said her son outgrew them walking to the temple. Reused heel cord for her new pair. This entry is both mundane and tender. It reveals a detail about Saburo's approach. Materials were not discarded casually. Even broken sandals were repurposed. A heel cord, once woven tightly, was stronger than new straw. This reuse was not only practical, it was spiritual. In Buddhist-influenced craft philosophy, an object that has served well contains kokoro, heart, or spirit. It deserves to continue serving, in a new form if needed. So Saburo's workshop was not a place of disposal, but of transition. November 12th. Bandits in the hills. Fewer travelers. No one came today. Mended an old pair of my own. This is the only direct mention of unrest. 1467 marked the beginning of the Unin War, a devastating civil conflict that would reduce much of Kyoto to ash over the next decade. While the diary does not describe battle, it contains the tremors. Silence, absence, fewer footsteps in the lane. Some customers come no more. Some sandals remain unclaimed. Saburo keeps them on a narrow shelf near the door. November 16th. Soldier's sandals. Freshly made, already frayed. Paid with copper ring. I wrote nothing on the receipt. Receipts were rare in this line of work, but sometimes given to soldiers or merchants who needed proof of payment. Saburo usually copied the transaction onto folded rice paper and handed it over. This time he didn't. The diary offers no explanation. Perhaps the soldier's look. Perhaps the weight of the war pressing more heavily on the shop. Perhaps the feeling that the soldier wouldn't survive long enough to present the receipt. Shoes can be prophecy. December 3rd. Cold wind. Stiff straw. No shoes today. Watched dust collect on the wall beams. This single line is deeply evocative of winter in Kyoto and of a craftsman's waiting season. Few people traveled in winter unless forced. Straw becomes brittle. Waraji wear through faster. Shoemakers waited. The diary entries slow. But Saburo keeps writing, not daily, but thoughtfully. He reflects on the footpaths of Kyoto, on the soft patter of slippers at dawn, on the sound of sandals being left at the temple steps. He writes of footsteps heard but not seen, of shoes made and never worn. His work is fading, but his awareness grows sharper. December 9th. The sandals for the tea master were returned. He said they were too quiet. I think that was a compliment. There's humor here, a kind Saburo rarely shows. In the tea ceremony, silence is valued. A shoe that whispers across the tatami is more welcome than one that clacks. Too quiet may mean well-made, unnoticeable, in harmony with the room. Saburo writes nothing more about it. But one imagines him smiling. The diary, in its second-to-last page, carries only this. December 14th. Mended heel with no destination. And the final entry, a drawing, a sandal, half-shaped, the thong unlooked, the sole not yet trimmed, as if he began writing the next repair and was called away. Or perhaps he was not. Perhaps he left it open, unfinished, like the road itself. The year is turning. Snow has begun to fall over Kyoto. It settles softly on the tiled rooftops of temples and the bark of persimmon trees, and on the worn slats of Saburo's sandal shop. Inside, the air is still. The lamp has gone cold. The tools are wrapped in cloth and tucked neatly into their shelves. A final sandal, only half-bound, rests quietly on the work mat. There are no more diary entries. Saburo disappears from the record, not abruptly, but gently. Like most artisans of his era, he did not expect to be remembered. And yet, through his spare, practical, and poetic notes, he left a record not of greatness, but of attention. This final section is not about Saburo himself, but about what remains when a life has passed through the world with almost no trace except for shoes. Saburo's work, like the footprints his sandals made, was impermanent by design. Zori, Waraji, and Geta were meant to be worn through. Their soles were thin, their cords frayed with use. Even the best pairs, those reinforced with twisted rush or softened with cloth, lasted only a few weeks under heavy travel. The sandals were not heirlooms. They were tools of transition. Saburo never wrote the names of his customers in full. He referred to them by trade. The monk, the tea master, the messenger, the mother. Perhaps he didn't know their names. Or perhaps he didn't need to. In his world, identity lived in gesture and need. A pair of sandals, well-worn, told the story. One carried ink stains from a scribe's morning commute. Another was torn at the toe, perhaps from a stumble on temple steps. One pair came wrapped in cloth, with a note. Return not needed. These served me well. May they serve again. We do not know what Saburo did with them. Perhaps he took them apart and used the thong to mend another. Perhaps he set them by the door, unclaimed but not discarded. This was his way. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. In the swirl of the Muromachi period, a time of courtly decline, civil unrest, and rising samurai power, Saburo's life appears like a still pool. The Unin War, which would soon engulf Kyoto in chaos and fire, is never named in his diary. Yet we feel its weight in absence. Fewer visitors, missing payments, the silence of no footsteps at dusk. The shoemaker was not a soldier, nor a noble. He held no blade, yet his life intersected all paths. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, monks, they all came to his mat, handed over their weary shoes, and left a bit of their journey in return. And Saburo quietly repaired them. That act, so humble, so often overlooked, is what makes his diary matter. It is not the story of a war. It is the story of walking through one. Legacy in fragments. What remains of Saburo's world? A few pages, preserved behind a beam. A drawing of a sandal. Some worn tools found decades later, their leather wraps long decayed. The diary itself, now housed in a Kyoto University archive, is seldom displayed. It is too fragile, too faint. And yet, historians have studied it for clues about everyday life. How repairs were priced, how straw was twisted, how late into the year sandals were still made. One professor called it a footnote in the literature of impermanence. But footnotes can reveal everything. The language in the diary suggests a man who was literate but self-taught. The brushwork is slow, but deliberate. There is almost no embellishment, no opinion, just record. As if writing was not expression, but continuation of craft, of care, of daily rhythm. One of the last sandals believed to be his, a preserved waraji with 3 knotted thongs, is still intact in a small rural museum. It is labeled, modestly, 15th C. Work sandal. Unknown artisan. But we know. And when you look at it, frayed, softened at the heel, the knots slightly uneven, you understand something more clearly than words could tell. This was not made in haste. This was made for walking. This was made with hands that listened. Not all stories in history roar. Some whisper through straw, through thread, through the faint indentation left by a heel on wood. Saburo's diary is not a tale of invention or rebellion. It is a tale of continuity, the stitching of daily life into something serviceable. When we speak of forgotten professions, we often imagine trades that vanished. But Saburo's trade did not vanish, it evolved. The need to repair, to mend, to care for what carries us never goes away. Today, mass-produced shoes are discarded before they fray. Shoemakers are rare. Diaries are typed, if written at all. But the spirit of shokunin kashitsu lives on in any craft done with care, without rush, and without expectation of fame. And perhaps that is Saburo's real gift. A reminder that attention is its own form of permanence. So the next time your shoe creaks, or your heel rubs against the worn lining, imagine Saburo hunched by lamplight, stitching, twisting, and gently brushing the dust from a sole. Not for glory, not for praise, but simply to help someone walk a little further, softly and well. High in the Andes, where the clouds seem to skim the mountains like dust off a woven cloth, the Incan Empire once stretched across thousands of miles, from present-day Ecuador down to Chile and Argentina. Roads twisted through mountain passes, over valleys and plateaus. Messengers ran in sandals made of llama hide. Armies marched in formation. Maize was dried on terraces. And somewhere in the humming bureaucracy of this vast, stone-spined civilization, laundry baskets were being woven, packed, transported, and counted. Yes, laundry. This is the story of how the Inca managed the washing, drying, and sorting of clothing and textiles across their empire. Not the clothing of emperors, but of priests, workers, and administrators. And how the humble laundry basket, woven from reeds, stitched with yucca fibers, sometimes labeled in string quipu code, played a quiet yet astonishingly complex role in the daily life of a people who moved without wheels, but never without a system. To understand laundry in the Incan world, you must first understand cloth. Textiles weren't just fabric. They were wealth, status, currency, and even prayer. The Inca wove garments from cotton in the lowlands, alpaca and llama wool in highland regions, vicuña, reserved for the nobility and gods, tunics, unku, shawls, likla, and belts, chumpi, were crafted with obsessive detail, dyed with cochineal red, indigo blue, and subtle greens from mall leaves. Some textiles were so finely woven, more than 600 threads per inch, that Spanish chroniclers described them as silk-like. So when these garments needed washing, they didn't just go into a river. They entered the Yanacuna system, laundry baskets, woven from reeds harvested near Lake Titicaca and braided into soft-sided ovals, became mobile data units. Their construction was standardized, at least by Incan standards, roughly 18 to 24 inches wide, low enough to carry on one's hip, and fitted with wrap straps or reed lids. A typical basket might contain 3 to 4 cotton tunics, 2 woven belts, 1 llama wool shawl, a packet of charcoal soap, sasha jabin, a tagged cord, a simple quipu, with knots signifying quantity, type, and owner. The quipu tags were ingenious. While full-size quipus were used for accounting and census work, laundry quipus were more localized. A blue strand for cotton, a white strand for llama wool, a red strand with a loop might signal, return to Temple District. These codes were known by basket keepers, low-ranking administrators responsible for maintaining textile movement logs. And while we don't have intact examples of laundry quipus, their mention survives in fragments of post-conquest documents and archaeological notes from Cusco and Huánuco Pampa. Excerpt from a 17th century Spanish account, adapted from Quechua testimony. The women brought the garments in reed baskets, knotted with strings. The cords told them where the tunic was to go after the river. No woman washed another's cloth by mistake. Logistics on foot. Laundry baskets weren't just kept near the river. They traveled. In large estates, baskets were carried from work camps to washing areas several miles away. Messengers, chasquis, sometimes delivered baskets along the Capac-Nan road system, especially when urgent garments were needed in other districts. Soldiers' uniforms were laundered centrally, then shipped out via llama caravans. In royal courts, laundry baskets moved through entire chains of processing. 1. Collection with quipu tagging. 2. Washing by hand with plant ash or sapin-enriched roots. 3. Drying on raised rock platforms or stretched cords. 4. Brushing with cactus spines to remove lint. 5. Folding in regional patterns, e.g. trifolds for belts, double rolls for tunics. 6. Return, matched with original quipu, basket lid sealed with braided twine. Each stage was performed in rhythm with the Incan calendar, often timed to moon cycles or labor festivals. There are references to laundry weeks held before major festivals like Inti Raymi, when all ceremonial clothing had to be washed, mended, and sanctified. Laundry and ritual. For the Inca, washing clothes was more than hygiene. It was symbolic purification. Garments retained the spirit of their wearers. To wash them was to cleanse the person, especially before rituals, travel, or offerings. In some regions, certain rivers were considered cleaners of sin. Clothes would be washed in upstream pools, never downstream, to ensure purity. The baskets themselves were occasionally sprinkled with maize beer, chicha, or incense, particularly when used in sacred textile handling. One basket, discovered in a burial cache near the Sacred Valley, contained small woven cloths bundled in llama hair string. The cloths were badly decayed, but the basket structure remained. Analysis showed the interior had been rubbed with wild mint and soaproot, a kind of ancient fabric softener. Even in death, the Inca carried clean garments. December 21st, post-solstice record from a colonial scribe. In the upper district, women bathe the clothes of the statue priest. These they place in baskets, then hang high to dry where wind may kiss them. They do not speak as they fold. As you watch one of these baskets being packed, the rhythm is unmistakable. Fold, align, place, knot. A system of care, precision, and memory. The basket is hoisted to the shoulder and disappears down the valley trail, its reed slats creaking gently. One item among thousands. One humble part of an empire run not just by warriors or priests, but by those who kept the clothing folded, sorted, and always moving. And so you might ask, what does it say about a civilization when its laundry was not just washed but counted? Imagine a courtyard nestled in the center of an Incan tambo, a way station for travelers along the Capac Nan, the great Inca road. The stones underfoot are warm from the midday sun. A pile of emptied reed laundry baskets sits near a wall, drying after the morning's deliveries. On a flat rock shelf nearby, folded garments rest in perfect symmetry, their dyes still bright, their fibers still soft from the wash. This is not a domestic scene. It is administrative. In this section, we look closer at how the act of laundering something seemingly mundane was elevated into a civic function of the empire. Through the Incas' meticulous organization, laundering garments became not just a chore, but a tracked, ritualized, and symbolic form of service to the state. Cleanliness as civic duty. In the Incan worldview, cleanliness was not only a matter of personal hygiene. It reflected order, respect, and spiritual harmony. Just as land was terraced and water channeled, so too were bodies and garments to be kept in their proper cycles of renewal. The Inca placed particular emphasis on preparing for rituals, festivals, and visits by high-ranking officials. During the great solar festivals, Inti Raymi, Capac Raymi, and others, local populations would submit textiles for cleaning and inspection. Even low-ranking citizens might have their best unku, tunic, refreshed in time for a public gathering. Evidence from the chronicles of Guaman Poma de Ayala, an indigenous Andean historian writing after the conquest, suggests that laundry work was built into the MITA system. That is, it was a part of the labor tax expected of commoners. Unlike farming or road building, laundry could be done by women, elders, and the infirm. It was considered an honorable, if uncelebrated, contribution. Some MITA workers specialized in laundry-related duties for royal and administrative households. In large cities like Cusco and Huánuco Pampa, these workers belonged to a class of craft laborers who were supervised by Caracas, local lords, and Quipacamayaks, record-keepers. Their work was logged, often literally, through notched cords and color-coded strings. The sorting process, folding as taxonomy. Once garments were washed, they underwent an equally precise sorting process. This wasn't merely aesthetic. The way a textile was folded or tied indicated the garment's intended owner, its function, ceremonial, daily use, military, the district of origin, its repair or wear status, return or redistribution destination. Textiles were folded using specific crease methods that ensured they could be stored efficiently and unfolded without wrinkling. A key detail for clothing worn during ritual or court ceremony. Descriptions by early Spanish observers describe entire storerooms, called culcas, where textiles were kept not just in baskets, but in layered systems of folded cloth. These warehouses were often built into hillsides, taking advantage of cool, dry air to preserve fabric integrity. Each culca had a caretaker, often an elder craftsman or woman, who knew how to interpret the folding language. A triple fold with a knotted thong meant return to family. A wrapped roll with a feather indicated prepared for burning in sacrifice. The basket keepers. Not all those who worked with laundry were washers. Some, called apachitas in oral tradition, were basket keepers. Their role was to receive baskets, read their kipu tags, log them into regional records via Quippacamaic, and direct the baskets to the appropriate wash team. They also monitored for loss, misplacement, or theft, rare but possible in a large system. Because the baskets were used repeatedly, sometimes for years, each one acquired a kind of personality. Some were more flexible and used for everyday garments. Others were rigid, reserved for vicunal garments or clothing bearing sacred symbols. In interviews conducted in the 20th century among Quechua-speaking elders in the Andes, stories persisted of certain families who, even into modern times, continued to weave named baskets, ones associated with ancestral spirits or specific purposes. These may echo, faintly, the basket keeper's traditions, repairs, patching, and the life cycle of a garment. Clean clothes also required maintenance. After washing, garments were examined for wear and damage. Those deemed salvageable were passed to weavers or patchworkers. These artisans used matching fibers, sometimes unraveled from older cloths, to repair damage in a way that honored the integrity of the original weave. Garments with ceremonial embroidery or geometric takapu patterns required specialists, who understood both the technique and the meaning of the symbols. A patch placed incorrectly could be seen as disrespectful or even unlucky. Interestingly, these repaired garments were not seen as diminished. In fact, some scholars argue that visible repair, when done well, added spiritual value. An object that had served well and been renewed was imbued with persistence, and therefore with respect. The basket would often accompany the garment through this process. One strand added to the tag might indicate a waiting patch. 2 loops might mark return to full service. The forgotten fleet of carriers. All of this depended on human movement. Men and women who carried baskets between homes, kulkas, riverbanks, and ceremonial plazas were often unsung. They walked dozens of miles, often barefoot or in thin sandals, balancing baskets on their hips or backs. Some baskets were woven with shoulder straps, reeds twisted into loops, wrapped in llama sinew or cotton cord. Others were carried atop the head, supported by a hand-woven cloth pad known as a likla. They walked carefully. A jostled basket could damage the contents, misalign the folds, or shift the precious tags. These carriers were trained in restraint. Their gait was smooth, their posture upright. One Spanish soldier, observing a festival in Cusco, wrote with surprise that the women who bore the clothing came before the priests, and the baskets moved as if gliding across the earth. The spiritual and the mundane. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Incan laundry practice is its seamless blending of utility and ritual. Washing a tunic for a festival was not separate from washing a fieldworker's belt. Both were acts of continuity, ensuring that garments served their purpose, carried their energy, and returned to the cycle of use. In this system, the laundry basket was not merely a vessel. It was an extension of the empire's rhythm. Like the quipu, like the terrace, like the woven bridge, it was an engineered tool of order. And like so much in the Incan world, it was designed to vanish beautifully. The reeds decayed, the tags fell away, the garments turned to dust. But the system endured, whispering through the folds. The sun sets behind the Andes, washing the terraces in a warm, golden light. The wind brushes the grass of the highland slopes where once the footsteps of carriers, priests, and weavers passed daily, their reed baskets swaying with each step. Though centuries have passed, the quiet infrastructure of laundry, the folding, sorting, and caring for cloth, still echoes in the land. In this final section, we trace the slow unraveling of the Incan laundry system, its transformation under Spanish colonial rule, and the lingering presence of its forms and ideas. We also reflect on how these humble woven baskets, rarely given names, never enshrined in temples, held the empire's softness, its order, and its care. Laundry in the afterlife. Among the most surprising archaeological discoveries in Incan burial sites are bundles of washed and folded clothing stored in baskets. In tombs near Lake Titicaca, researchers found multiple graves where bodies were wrapped in fine cloth, with additional garments and sandals folded beside them, some nestled into reed containers lined with animal skin or cactus fibers. Why include laundry in a tomb? Part of the answer lies in Andean cosmology. For the Inca, the afterlife was a journey, and the dead needed clothing as much as the living did. But more than practicality, clean garments signaled spiritual readiness. Just as bodies were sometimes bathed before burial, clothing too had to be refreshed. One chronicle describes how the garments of deceased nobles were washed ceremonially before being placed in tombs. In some rituals, family members would carry baskets of laundered clothes up a mountain path, singing softly as they climbed. The clothes were not burned, but left folded in silence, ready for use in the world to come. A museum display in Cusco features a reconstructed burial. The body reclines, knees drawn to chest, wrapped in layers of alpaca cloth. Beside it sits a humble basket. Inside are 2 belts, a headcloth, and a folded tunic, patched at the shoulder. All were washed. Colonial disruption and the end of the basket system. With the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century, much of the Incan world was upended. Temples were looted. Quipus were destroyed. Systems of labor were co-opted into encomiendas, and new hierarchies formed. The laundry baskets, their meanings, tags, and order were never fully outlawed, but they lost their structure. The basket keepers, if they survived, were either absorbed into domestic labor systems or cast aside. The MITA labor for public service became forced labor under colonial mining regimes. Women who once laundered in temple courtyards now washed garments for Spanish households. Yet some customs remained. In rural towns well into the 18th century, laundry continued to be sorted using colored strings tied to baskets, an echo of the old quipu tags. Spanish priests, often confused by the system, described it as native superstition, never realizing it was a form of information encoding older than their own written records. In some areas, families adapted their own basket rituals. A grandmother might wash and sort family garments into baskets marked by knot patterns known only to her and her daughters. Though stripped of state support, the structure endured in private. The baskets, in other words, never truly left. The resilient weave. In the 20th century, anthropologists working in Peru recorded stories from Quechua-speaking elders who remembered their grandparents' basket systems. These were not Incan in a strict historical sense, but they bore the same principles. Respect for folded cloth. Organization of garments by status and use. Use of reed or straw baskets for transport. Ritualized care for garments before travel or burial. In one village, it was considered bad luck to toss clothing unfolded into a basket. The threads will twist in anger, one elder said. Another believed that weaving baskets for newborns should follow the pattern of laundry baskets, so the baby will grow into a tidy soul. The logic of care, rhythm, and meaning had outlived the empire itself. Even today, in traditional Peruvian markets, vendors still use tightly woven baskets to carry fabric, cords, or folded garments to stalls. The baskets are different now, modern dyes, industrial thread, but the shape remains. The motion of the hand is the same. Lift, fold, nestle into place. What the baskets taught. It's easy to think of empires in terms of conquests and constructions. Roads built, temples raised, armies fielded. But empires also run on cloth, on rhythm, on the careful movement of things folded, cleaned, and returned. The Inca understood this, perhaps better than we do. Their baskets told stories, not of drama, but of repetition. They asked questions like, who wore this tunic last, and where were they going? Who made this belt, and will someone repair it again? Is this cloth ready for ceremony, or only for tomorrow's fieldwork? Can we mark the path not by war, but by washline? The Incan laundry basket was never meant to endure. It was made of reeds, after all. But its logic, the gentleness of folding, the elegance of order, the attention paid to things easily overlooked, has not vanished. Perhaps it remains with us every time we sort clothes, fold sleeves, or smell the sunlight in fresh linen. In a small stone cell tucked into the flank of a wind-battered hill in 9th century Ireland, a monk dips a narrow quill into a dark, glistening pool of ink. The manuscript he's copying is a gospel, maybe a psalter. The lines must be straight. The ink must not blot. And the sheep outside the window must stop baaing long enough for him to concentrate. This is a story of ink. Not just any ink, but the slow, methodical, faintly sheep-scented ink of early Irish monastic scribes. Before the printing press, before movable type or carbon paper or even chalk slates in village schools, there was the monk, the quill, the ink pot, and a lot of animal skin. And the ink itself? It was a recipe centuries in the making, part chemistry, part ritual, part weather guesswork. Each batch was slightly different. Some turned reddish-brown, some glistened with hints of violet, some darkened over years into near-black permanence. In this section, we'll walk through how this ink was made, the small daily habits of the monks who made it, and how, more often than not, something or someone or some animal interrupted the whole process. The monastery as ink factory. Medieval Irish monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were cultural engines. Scriptoriums, writing rooms, libraries, farms, workshops, and in many cases, repositories of fading Roman knowledge. Take Clonmacnoise, for example, a major center of learning by the River Shannon, or the more remote Skellig Michael, where monks clung to a rocky island and transcribed texts with fingers stiff from sea spray. The monks were copying scripture, theology, classical texts, and even, occasionally, bits of practical knowledge. Planting calendars, weather omens, cures for sheep bellyache. Ink was essential. But unlike modern ballpoint ink, which you might purchase in a tidy plastic cartridge, monastic ink was handmade in small batches using whatever was at hand: oak galls, iron, water, wine, honey, and patience. The recipe varied by region and season. Step 1. The gall of the oak. The base of most Irish monastic ink was the oak gall, a strange, knobby growth that appears on oak leaves when a tiny wasp lays its egg inside. The tree responds by forming a protective lump, and that lump becomes rich in tannic acid. Inksmith monks would gather galls in the late summer or early fall, carefully selecting the roundest, darkest specimens. The galls were crushed with a mortar and pestle, sometimes made of stone, sometimes simply a large flat rock and another rock slightly less flat. The crushed galls were then soaked in rainwater or wine, ideally in a ceramic pot that wouldn't react to the tannins. Over the course of several days, the liquid turned an earthy brown, rich with the compound that would bind with iron to create the ink's signature darkness. Monk's diary fragment, translated from Latin. The galls were too few. Brother Sechnall trampled them by mistake. Again. Step 2. Iron, fire, and the rusty nail. To darken the ink, iron was needed. Most often, this came in the form of rust scraped from old tools, nails, or the inside of cooking pots. In some cases, iron sulfate was added, a greenish mineral found in peat bogs or produced through alchemical tinkering. Rusty iron was simmered in the gall liquid, creating a reaction that turned the ink deep black or bluish-gray. If the proportions were wrong, the ink would become watery or worse, clump into jelly. In winter, heating the mixture was a challenge. Monks had to wait for the hearth to be free, and more than one batch of ink was spoiled when someone tossed in stew or burned the fire too hot. And yes, someone usually blamed Brother Sechnall. From a margin note in a surviving psalter, "This ink is weak," like Brother Sechnall's excuses. Step 3. Honey, vinegar, and the just right stickiness. To keep the ink from flaking off the parchment after drying, a sticky substance was often added. A bit of honey, sometimes gum arabic if available, or even boiled down moss resin. A touch of vinegar prevented mold. This stage was where each monk's house recipe came into play. Some preferred a syrupy finish. Others liked their ink thin and quick-drying. A bad batch meant hours of recopying, or worse, ruined vellum. But the ingredients also depended on availability. If the sheep were sick or the beehives had failed, the monk might experiment with ale or ox bile. Ink-making was, in this sense, part science, part seasonal improvisation. The sheep outside the window. Now we must speak of the sheep. In the Irish monastic world, sheep were not only crucial for wool and milk, they were parchment factories on 4 legs. Their skins, carefully treated and stretched, became vellum, the soft, durable writing surface used for everything from gospels to tax records. But sheep were also wanderers, and loud. Monks at Kells, Bangor, or Glendalough often penned complaints, literal marginal notes, about the interruptions caused by livestock. One scribe wrote an entire side column describing the sounds of a lamb bleating nonstop while he tried to copy the Psalms. Another monk wrote, Simply, the cow has been in the herb garden again. I am going outside. And yet, these animals were part of the rhythm. When the ink dried too slowly, monks might take the page outside, pin it to a board, and let the sheep's breath warm it dry. When the ink clumped, sheep tallow was added. When parchment tore, it was patched with tiny threads, usually wool. The distractions were real, but so was the dependence. Ink as devotion. Every time a monk stirred ink over a hearth, crushed oak galls on a rock, or gently brushed away a blotch with a rabbit hair brush, he was performing more than a task. He was joining a chain of memory, a tradition of transmitting thought, faith, and careful attention. The ink itself was sacred, not because of what it contained, but because of how it was made. Slowly, deliberately, with full presence of mind. And if a sheep bleated outside, or a gust of wind blew the manuscript half off the desk, well, that was part of the ritual, too. As one monk scribbled in the corner of a now fragile psalter, "It is raining. The ink is thin. The sheep are shouting. I write anyway. Let's return to the scriptorium. That cold stone room smelling faintly of sheep hide, damp wool cloaks, and smoky rushlights. The air is still, except for the slow, rhythmic scratching of a quill on vellum. A monk, perhaps Brother Murchertak or Brother Brianane, bends over his writing board with brow furrowed and hands steady. His ink, carefully mixed the day before from gall, rust, and vinegar, rests in a walnut shell or a hollowed horn cup at his side. The quill, cut from a goose feather, must be sharpened every few hours with a small knife known as a penknife. Each line he writes is a meditation on God, on discipline, and occasionally on the bothersome sheep who has decided to headbutt the door again. This section explores the life of the medieval Irish scribe, the tools they used, the distractions they faced, and the surprisingly human notes they left behind. The tools of the trade. Contrary to modern assumptions, the medieval monastic scribe did not simply dip and write. Each element of the writing process was a discipline of its own. Quills, typically from goose, swan, or crow. Each feather was aged, hardened, and carved into a nib. Different nibs were used for different scripts, wide tips for titles, fine points for dense passages. Knives. The penknife, yes, that's where the term comes from, trimmed the quill. A second knife was used to scrape away mistakes from vellum, which was forgiving up to a point. Ruling tools. Lines were drawn with a stylus or lead point across the page, often guided by a template or compass. Scribes called it ruling the leaf. Inkhorn or shell. A small container, often from a real horn or a large nut, held the ink. It needed to be steady and protected. One careless elbow could ruin days of work. But perhaps most important of all was the scribe's body. His posture, his breath, his patience. Writing for hours meant managing cramps, cold toes, and fading light. From a 9th century scribe's margin. 3 fingers write, but the whole body labors. Margins that talk back. If you've ever read a medieval Irish manuscript, you've likely seen the result of intense concentration. Beautiful, tightly written script. Flowing lines. Occasionally ornate decoration, Celtic knots, spirals, animal forms. But in the margins, that's where the monks whispered. Some of these side notes were practical. Ink running low. Begin next section after matins. Fix spelling in line 12. Others were deeply human. It is cold today. My hand is stiff. A stranger brought fish for supper. And still others are, well, sheep-related. The lamb is inside again. Brother Fiacre is trying to catch it. A great bleeding near the window. I believe it is a sign. These marginalia are more than jokes. They remind us that scribes were not ethereal monks floating on clouds of holy light. They were tired, distracted, hungry, curious, bored, and often deeply funny. Smudges and mistakes. Ink was fragile. It dried slowly, and smudging was a constant danger. Some monks blew gently over their pages to speed drying. Others waved feathers. One text bears a long, dark streak across 3 lines, believed to be the result of a scribe sneezing mid-sentence. Corrections were made by scraping the vellum surface with a knife, then rubbing chalk dust to smooth the fibers. But too many corrections made a page look sloppy, and for sacred texts this was unacceptable. Some manuscripts contain entire pages restarted. Others contain crossed-out lines with a simple note, "Let it lie." Perhaps the most striking example comes from the Book of Armagh, where a scribe, after writing nearly an entire page, added this at the bottom, "The ink failed. I am tired. It is best to sleep." Weather, light, and time. Ireland's weather is famously wet, gray, and unpredictable. For monks working by natural light or flickering rush lamps, it was a challenge. Days were short in winter. Dampness affected both ink and parchment. In some monasteries, windows were covered with thin animal membranes to block wind while letting light through. But many scribes simply braved the elements. Some wore woolen hoods while working. Others wrapped their hands in cloth to prevent shaking. Yet they persisted. A monk might copy 20 pages in a week if all went well. But more often, progress was slow. Illness, chores, visitors, or weather could delay the process. And then, inevitably, there were the sheep, the ever-present flock. Sheep played a central role in the scriptorium. Not in the room itself, though one might wander in, but in the materials, metaphors, and interruptions. The vellum pages were sheep. The quill might have been from a crow who chased sheep from the fields. The ink's acidity, when too strong, could cause the writing to bleed through particularly thin skins, especially those from younger lambs. A monk's whole literary world, in a sense, bleeded. Some monks seem to have embraced this. In glosses, we find sheep-related puns and metaphors. Like sheep, these letters follow the pen. Each word, a woolen thread in the Lord's cloak. One charming manuscript even includes a tiny drawing of a sheep wearing spectacles, with the note, "He too wishes to read," the page as a prayer. Despite the distractions, the aching fingers, the ink that clumped or the sheep that screamed at precisely the wrong moment, monastic scribes saw their work as holy, not just because of what they copied, but because of how they copied it. Each letter was formed with attention, each line aligned with care. Even mistakes, when made humbly, were part of the labor of love. The ink was imperfect. The page could smudge. But through it all, the act of writing was an act of devotion. Not a performance, not a show, but a slow, quiet journey, word by word, through the fog, the wool, and the ever-watching sheep. In a museum case in Dublin, under low lighting and behind protective glass, rests a page from a 9th century Irish manuscript. The vellum is yellowed, its edges curled like old bark. Across the page runs a line of delicate script, compact, angular, and patient. The ink has darkened over centuries into a soft brown. Near the bottom, in the margin, a note, "I am cold. I am lonely. I write." This anonymous scribe may have lived in a stone hut at Glendalough or a wind-racked cell on Iona. We will never know his name, but his letters, his careful strokes, his persistent copying across days and seasons, they remain. In this final section, we explore how these humble efforts, powered by homemade ink, crude tools, and sheep-interrupted focus, built something far greater than their creators may have imagined. A living legacy of language, knowledge, and grace. The transmission of memory. Medieval Irish monasticism was marked by a deep love of the written word, not just for scripture, but for language itself. Ireland, famously, preserved vast swathes of classical literature during Europe's so-called Dark Ages, copying works of Latin authors, early Christian writings, and even fragments of Greek philosophy. These texts were preserved not in great cities or imperial libraries, but in remote outposts, where monks huddled beside hearths with rain pattering on the slate above. And always ink. The ink that stained those pages was never meant to last forever. Yet many of those pages survive 1,000 years on. The composition, oak gall, iron, vinegar, proved surprisingly resilient. It bound to the vellum and aged gracefully. Some inks, exposed to too much sun or acidic vellum, faded. Others deepened to an earthy red-black. The point is not that the ink endured, but that the act of writing did. From sheep to scripture, let us follow the journey of one page. 1. A lamb is born in early spring, its wool white and damp, its bleat surprisingly shrill. 2. That lamb grows, grazes, and, after its time, is selected by the monastery's herdsman for parchment. 3. Its hide is cleaned, soaked, stretched, scraped, and dried on a wooden frame. The scribe runs a hand over the surface, smooth, creamy, with just a hint of texture. 4. Meanwhile, galls are crushed, rust is stirred into vinegar, and the ink is mixed. It smells metallic, slightly sour. 5. A quill is sharpened, dipped, and brought to the page. 6. The monk writes slowly, deliberately. A psalm, a list, a letter, a litany. He writes not knowing who will read it. But read it someone does. A century later, another monk adds a gloss in the margin. Prayer, a note of thanks, a complaint about supper. Centuries after that, a historian studies it, marveling at the clarity of the script. And now you are thinking about that monk, that lamb, that ink pot. The chain is unbroken. The sheep returns. It's worth returning to the sheep, for they were never far. In manuscripts, they are drawn, sometimes solemn, sometimes silly. In one psalter, a tiny sheep wears a halo, a symbol of the Lamb of God. In another, a monk doodled a lamb eating a scroll with the caption, "He is not hungry for scripture, but for mischief." In life, the sheep were both nuisance and necessity. They were milked, sheared, herded, mended, and muttered at. They interrupted prayers, gnawed on manuscript pages, and sometimes, according to more than one complaint, stared uncomfortably through the window during particularly tricky passages. Yet they were beloved, quietly, persistently. As one monk scribbled near the end of a treatise, "The sheep bleats again. He is faithful in his way." Ink as testament. What can we learn from these monks, their sheep, and their ink? Not just about chemistry or scribal practice or the structure of early Irish monasteries, but something gentler, something slower. That care, taken consistently, leaves marks that endure. That even distractions, woolly, muddy, uninvited, can be woven into a life of purpose. That making something by hand, day after day, in the quiet, is an act of faith. The monks did not write to be remembered. They wrote because writing mattered. They mixed ink because words needed bodies. They chased sheep because someone had to. They sat at their desks in cold stone rooms with thin windows and scratched line after line with frozen fingers, not knowing if anyone would read them. And here we are,